You can find someone else. Not unless you want your face to look like a Picasso painting. An hour later, Terry met me in Lower Manhattan. She got right to the point. What's our plan of attack? I was thinking we start at his office and see where he goes. The problem is, some of the financial people stay kind of late. This is a tough one. It's not like a surveillance where we can hide in a crowd. This guy lives at a different altitude than most people. I can see if I can get into the building, maybe poke around a few places, at least see if he's definitely inside. I thought about Terry's offer. Perhaps I should have figured this out before I'd bothered her. I just wasn't sure what else to do. We talked about it for a few more minutes. Then I got a text. I looked down at my phone. It was from Ronald Higdon Esquire, thanking me for squaring everything with Detective Matthews of the 1st Precinct. The end of the text had a key piece of information. It read, "Someone told me your suspect hangs out at a bar in Lower Manhattan called Rain." I chuckled out loud. Terry said, "What's so funny?" Informants. Mine just gave me an idea for a plan. But it shows he was holding information back the last time we talked. Terry said, "They always hold something back to negotiate with later." I nodded. I don't know why that's so hard to remember. So what's our new plan? I looked at her, smiled, and said, "I don't think you're going to like my idea." Terry gave me one of her flat stares and said, "I rarely do." Chapter 36. I thought my plan had flair and creativity. I explained it to Terry. From her expression, she didn't agree with my assessment. She took a step back, put her hands on her hips, cocked her head, and stared at me. Then, after a couple of seconds, she said, "You think I can walk into a bar filled with super slick, well-educated financial people and just fit in? Especially while I'm wearing cargo pants and a Yankees sweatshirt? Do I have that right, Mike? Your problem is self-confidence. You can still be a badass cop and beautiful." You sound exactly like my father. Thank you. I've always found Ramon to be very intelligent. Seriously, those guys will be dressed in $1,000 suits. What can I do? Put an NYPD raid jacket on to hide my sweatshirt? Then she straightened up and held one finger in the air, telling me to hang on. Terry slipped her phone out of her front pocket. She stepped away from me and made a quick call. After ending the call, she walked past me and said, "I'll meet you a block north of Rain in an hour. I want no funny comments or compliments about how I look. And you can tell no one that we tried this." Terry and I were rarely serious with each other. I wasn't even sure about this moment. To be on the safe side, I silently nodded my assent and watched her pull away in her city-issued Ford Explorer. 1 hour and 3 minutes later, I was standing on the corner of Fulton and Nassau Streets. I'd already walked past Rain. It had a healthy crowd that was growing by the minute. Terry had overestimated how well the clientele would be dressed. It was clearly a mix of financial people, but tourists and others were there as well. It looked like a high-end martini bar with a sports bar element. Like most cops, I notice people. I look at faces and pay attention to details. Today, I was probably more focused on the bar down the street. At least, that's the excuse I'm using for not noticing Terry's approach until she walked right up to me. It was tough not to say, "Wow." Luckily, I remembered her admonishment to withhold all comments, and Terry kept a scowl on her face to ensure I didn't open my mouth. She wore a dark blue cocktail dress and carried a small black clutch with pearls around the clasp. Her hair was brushed straight down her back. Most surprising was the red lipstick and dark eyeliner. I wasn't sure I'd ever seen Terry wear makeup. I carefully said, "How did you pull that off so quickly?" "My cousin lives on Mulberry Street near the 5th Precinct. We always share clothes when we go out. She works at a salon in Midtown. She's the one who did my makeup. She also insisted I brush out my hair and not leave it in a ponytail." Terry bit her lower lip like she was thinking about something. Then she said, "You may make one comment, and one comment only. You look fantastic. Good choice. Let's get this shit done." I said, "How do you want to do it? Wait till we see him go in, wait inside, split up, and I'll tell you if he's coming down the block?" "This could be a couple of nights of surveillance unless we get lucky." I thought about that. I said, "If it goes past tonight, I'll get us help in the form of a surveillance team. I'm not doing your crazy plan in front of a surveillance team." I figured I'd worry about that when and if the time came. I was trying to seize the initiative. Finally, I said, "Let's wait inside and give it a couple of hours. If he doesn't show, we'll make up another plan." Terry had a little grin. I said, "What is it?" She quickly glanced down the block. "Isn't that our man?" I stared as Kyle Banning approached the bar from the other end of the block. We were in business. Chapter 37. I walked into Rain a few minutes before Terry. She knew to come through the door and look for me. I intended to find a seat near Kyle Banning. Any kind of close surveillance like this had a boatload of things that could go wrong. I was hoping to identify and mitigate any of those problems. I scanned the place. It was about what I expected, kind of loud with a fraternity house feel. A few tourists sprinkled in with a lot of young guys with too much money. A long bar with high tops on the other wall. The whole place couldn't have been 30 feet wide. The narrow space gave it the feel of being popular, when in fact it looked crowded because it just wasn't that big. Behind the bar was a Tito's vodka-branded mirror, flanked by 4 TVs high on the wall. 2 TVs were tuned to ESPN channels, and 2 were on financial channels. I noticed closed captioning on CNBC and the Fox Business Network. This place was definitely catering to their clientele. I spotted Kyle Banning at the bar, talking to a pretty bartender with long blonde hair she wore in a ponytail draped over her shoulder. It was clear he was a regular. I casually took a stool 1 seat away from him. It wasn't too close, and he didn't look in my direction. Many of the stools at the bar were available. Most people gathered around the tables by the opposite wall. Maybe there were some tribal gatherings of the different financial houses. I wondered where Banning's buddies were. I noticed a couple of the guys at the bar turned to stare at the front door for a moment. I followed their gaze and was not surprised to see Terry Hernandez. She looked even better in the soft light of the bar. She had a certain expression I'd never seen on her. It was hard to describe. Maybe because her usual expression was annoyance verging on violence. Now she had a pleasant smile, and her dark eyes scanned the room. She casually walked toward the bar and sat down on the stool to my right, between Banning and me. At nearly the same time, a heavy-set young man in a suit plopped down on the stool to the left of me. He looked in my direction, but deduced I wasn't in the financial business, so he didn't bother to acknowledge me. The bartender finally came over and I ordered a beer. After she slid my beer in front of me, I was surprised to hear Terry order Old Forester bourbon straight up. I didn't know if it was a ploy, or if bourbon was Terry's usual drink of choice. Either way, it caught Kyle Banning's attention. If I concentrated, I could hear their conversation over the din of stockbrokers blowing off steam. Mostly small talk, but I could tell Banning had nice manners. He introduced himself and asked Terry a few questions about where she worked and lived. Terry had a set backstory for short undercover roles like this. She worked in the hospitality industry for a website that recommended hotels in the city. It was a tough story to pin down or confirm. I noticed she didn't give a last name either. Even though Banning used his full name, she just said, "Hi, I'm Terry." They seemed to be getting along, and I had full faith that Terry would ask all the right questions. Banning never looked past her or to his other side. A classic narcissistic move. No one else in the world existed. Terry started slowly, working the questions around to how many times Banning had come to this bar this week. I looked up at the mirror with the Tito's logo and saw Banning flash a charming smile as he said, "I usually go out in Lower Manhattan. I know a lot of the financial people. They're fun to hang out with." Terry said, I came in here Monday night. I don't remember seeing you." Suddenly, a commotion came up from the back of the bar. Everyone looked over their shoulders to see a group of well-dressed young men cheering a soccer match from England on the TV nearest them. It felt like soccer had replaced football among males under 30 these days. Maybe because most of them played soccer growing up, not football. I wanted to hear Banning's response to Terry's question. Then someone slipped onto the stool on the other side of the man to my left. I glanced up at the mirror again and froze. I knew the man who'd just sat down. I also knew why he was here. My right hand instinctively slid off the bar and into my lap, just in case I needed to draw my duty weapon. Chapter 38. Sometimes you have to wonder about fate or coincidence, or whatever you want to call it. Here I was, happy to be making some progress on a homicide case with an unusual investigative technique. Terry and I had the whole situation well in hand. Then I looked up and saw Robert Hatcher sit down at the bar. I tensed, recognizing him, then put my hand on my forehead and looked down like I was reading my phone. It had been a few years, but I was pretty sure Hatcher would recognize me. I'd helped on his arrest for aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. He was a low-level drug dealer with some kind of anger management issue. He'd shot at least 4 customers a few years ago, but we could only prove one case. A guy he'd shot in the face near the Fulton Street Fish Market. The victim had been lucky, and the bullet passed through his cheek. He'd lost a few teeth and about a third of his tongue, but he'd survived. It was clear that the 16 months Hatcher had spent in Attica hadn't done much to rehabilitate him. In the mere seconds he'd been sitting to my left, he had already slipped the tubby guy next to him a small envelope. I watched with my peripheral vision as the man slid some cash back to Hatcher. He wasn't even subtle. He just shoved the cash across the varnished wooden bar. I knew Hatcher would have a gun on him. What a great opportunity to get a dangerous criminal off the street. But I couldn't act, at least not at the moment. It would do nothing to help the homicide investigation I was actually working on. It may not have been Sophie's choice, but it was still a difficult decision. I was still trying to eavesdrop on Kyle Banning and Terry's conversation. But now, I was also trying to watch the pair on my left. If nothing else, I could text someone about what I just saw. Maybe we could get some help here quickly. When I glanced up in the mirror again, I locked eyes with Robert Hatcher. It was clear he recognized me. I almost nudged Terry. No matter what happened, I couldn't let the situation get out of hand. We were in a crowded bar in Manhattan. The tubby businessman sitting between me and Hatcher realized there was an issue. His hand started to shake. He used a napkin on the bar to wipe his face. Pieces of the napkin stuck to his cheeks and chin and made it look like he had whitehead acne. He scooted his stool backward and made a beeline for the front door. That left Hatcher and me staring at each other across an open space. I felt like an Old West gunfighter in a showdown. I tried to read the emotions on his face. I got nothing. My pulse increased and my hearing became sharper. At least that's how it feels while I'm under stress. This was going to be a close encounter no matter what happened. Then Robert Hatcher turned on his stool to face me. This was it. Chapter 39. Robert Hatcher kept both of his hands on the bar even as he faced me. He looked like every felon I'd ever pulled over as a patrol officer. They know to keep their hands on the steering wheel or stick them out the driver's window so the approaching cop can see their hands are empty. Hatcher didn't say a word. He slowly took his hands off the bar and held them in front of him. He didn't put them in the air, because that would attract attention and look like he was being robbed. Then he carefully backed away from me. About halfway to the front door he turned, then walked quickly until he disappeared outside. I considered calling someone, hoping to catch him with some dope and a gun on him, but I realized I couldn't solve all the city's problems in one evening. I was relieved things had played out the way they did. I focused back on Terry and Kyle Banning to my right. It didn't sound like Banning had answered any questions. Terry was going in another direction now. She kept a playful voice, but I knew her well enough to realize she was coming up with a new question as she spoke. Maybe something that would get this guy talking. Terry and I had discussed the possibility of having Banning follow her to a coffee shop on the corner. I'd reluctantly agreed that I could follow them by myself a few doors down to the mom-and-pop coffee shop called the Free Trade Shop. I sort of liked the subtle dig at Starbucks. Now Terry was using that option. I heard her say, "Want to go someplace a little quieter? Maybe the coffee shop down the street?" There was a pause. I couldn't believe how interested I was in hearing his response. Banning turned in his seat to face her. He had a sincere look on his face. He said, "Maybe we could meet at a hotel later, but I have a certain reputation among these guys, and no offense, but you are a couple of years older than the women they usually see me with. It may sound harsh, but reputation is everything in the financial industry." It was one of the dumbest, rudest comments I think I had ever heard. I wasn't sure I'd heard him correctly until I glanced down and saw Terry flexing her hand into a fist. Part of me wanted to see that punch land right on this guy's smug face, maybe knock a couple of those perfect teeth crooked. Instead, Terry did a more elegant thing. She threw what was left of her bourbon into his face. It was the perfect move on several levels. It maintained her undercover persona very nicely and gave her a release. It was clear Banning wasn't going to say much more in the bar. She had nothing to lose, and it was less awkward than slugging this creep. I tensed, waiting to see his reaction. Banning casually pulled a handkerchief from his suit pocket. The white hanky even had his initials monogrammed on it. Classy. Banning calmly blotted his face and chest. He kept a very mild expression as he looked up and said, "Does that mean you won't meet me at the Holiday Inn Express on Water Street?" Terry glared at him, but didn't say a word. Banning stood from his stool and said, "It was mostly nice chatting with you." I watched as he joined a group of chattering young men in the corner. Several of them were laughing, and one slapped Banning on the back. Terry sat at the bar and stared straight ahead. She mumbled to me, "I'll meet you back on the corner. I don't want to give this guy the satisfaction of thinking he chased me out of here. I'm going to have another drink." It looked like the direct approach was the only one I could take against Banning. This guy appeared pretty sharp, but first, I wanted to gather more information. Unless I had everything nailed down when I talked to him, he might get more from an interview than I would. Chapter 40. I was later than usual getting home, yet much earlier than I'd told Mary Catherine to expect me. I liked the little wave of surprise that ran through the kids when I walked through the door just as everyone was starting to eat dinner. Those smiles would stick in my memory forever. I smelled chicken cacciatore. That meant Ricky had probably made it. Mary Catherine liked more traditional meat and potatoes dishes. Ricky was a great cook who specialized in spicier Italian and even Cajun cuisine. I took a moment to run around the table and greet each kid individually. Then I gave Mary Catherine a kiss on the lips, earning us groans from just about every kid under 16. Then I made sure to give my grandfather a hug. I hoped his presence here meant that he was getting a handle on all the extra work he'd taken on around the parish. My grandfather made the kids sit still while he said a second prayer before I could eat. Seamus said, "Dear Father in heaven, please bless the food that my grandson is about to receive. Protect him during the day and bless him in the evening. Amen." In prayer, my grandfather always knows exactly what to say. He had touched on something I feel strongly about. My blessings at home. No matter what happens during the day, when I come home to these beautiful, smiling faces, I always thank God for the wonderful blessing. It's nothing I've ever said specifically to my grandfather, but he knows. Everyone knows. I listened intently to each kid as they talked about their day. Sure, Juliana and Brian had days that were more similar to mine than the younger kids. Juliana was taking an acting class as well as her academic classes at City College. Brian was working hard at the air conditioning repair service. He was also taking a class at City College. Chrissy told us about petting the class guinea pig until it fell asleep in her hand. Trent told us he'd aced a geometry exam, and that Sister Mala had held up his test as an example for the other kids. What I really wanted to hear about was whether the boys had been bullied today. I didn't want to ask about it. I didn't want to make it seem like the focus of the boys' lives, but it concerned me. It concerned me a great deal. I looked over at Fiona and said, "Did you get a chance to practice free throws?" She nodded excitedly. "Then I played horse with Trent, Ricky, and Eddie. I beat all three of them and only had an H." I couldn't help but smile as I looked at the boys. You would have thought they'd been caught stealing something the way they looked down at their plates and mumbled. When Ricky looked up, I could still see the shade of the black eye he had from the run-in with the bullies a few days earlier. He said, "On the bright side, Fiona doesn't punch us while we're playing." That earned a few snickers around the table. That's when Shauna chimed in on the subject for the first time. Boys think they have it so tough. Girls get bullied too. All the time. Especially online. Ricky reached up and touched his black eye. He winced and said, "I don't think I'd mind getting bullied online as much as being bullied in person." That opened an interesting conversation around the dinner table. Chapter 41. This was the kind of dinner conversation that most parents don't get to hear. I had always taught the kids to be tolerant and respectful of other people's opinions. This would be a good test of how effective I had been at getting that message across. We all started to discuss the problem of bullying. Almost immediately the lines were drawn. The boys all wanted to act tough. The girls used reasoning, a classic gender schism. Eddie said, "If our bullies didn't carry guns, we'd have taught them a lesson." Jane calmly pointed out, "The first time they bothered you, I don't remember hearing how super brave you were." Her maturity made her calm delivery that much more devastating to the boys. All three of them sputtered for an answer, but nothing came out. Bridget, normally quiet during these kinds of discussions, said, "I don't understand why you didn't just talk to the boys." Eddie groaned, then glared at his sister. "Believe me, they didn't want to listen." Chrissy chimed in with, "Why didn't you just run away?" Eddie appeared to be the official spokesman. He said, "Then the bullies win." "But you wouldn't get beat up." Shauna had offered it sincerely. "Who cares who wins?" I got it. It was a tough situation. When I was their age, bullying had a different edge to it. There were rarely any weapons involved. Parents stepped in when things got out of hand. I remembered Matthew Callahan's parents finding out he was taking lunch money from kids a grade younger than him. Matthew couldn't sit comfortably for a day after his father paddled him for stealing and bullying. I'm not saying I agree with those kinds of parenting tactics, but there's no denying that they occasionally got results. Chrissy turned to my grandfather. She said, "Grandpa Seamus, what did you do in the olden days if someone was bullying you?" Seamus leaned back in his chair and patted his belly like some kind of medieval Irish chieftain who had just finished off a meal of his enemy's entrails. At least that's how I imagined he viewed his display. Then he leaned forward and put his elbows on the table. Seamus said, "You mean way back in the 40s and 50s? Back before science had been invented?" Chrissy nodded her head vigorously. The older kids, Mary Catherine and I, all had to keep from laughing out loud. I was a little nervous about the answer because I'd heard a few stories about my grandfather's youth in Ireland. I wasn't sure they were the kind of stories I wanted my kids to hear, at least the ones still in elementary school. It was a different world back then. I went to a school attached to a Catholic church. I played soccer in the afternoons until someone introduced me to baseball. I remember one year I got a baseball bat for Christmas, and I felt like someone had given me a ticket to a whole new life. It was nothing like today." Eddie looked at my grandfather and said, "That sounds exactly like today." Seamus laughed. "Every generation thinks they're facing new issues. Did I get bullied as a youngster? Sure I did. I don't even remember any specific incidents. I got into a few scrapes, and my mother used to paddle me when I got home and tell me not to fight. One thing I learned: bullies hate to be confronted. I don't think I won many fights against bullies, but I must have done all right because I don't remember it happening too often. Bullies are cowards. The boys you described who have to carry a gun to feel important are the biggest cowards of all." I loved seeing the twinkle in my grandfather's eye as he told these stories with incredible detail, enthralling the kids. I enjoyed seeing the kids follow every word and want to hear more. In this case, my grandfather even gave me an idea. What was Kyle Banning if not a bully? Wealthy, good-looking, and entitled. Maybe it was time I stopped nibbling around the edges and headed directly to the bully's stronghold. Not his house, but his office. Chapter 42. The next morning, all I could think about was surprising Kyle Banning at his office. I did a little research on Banning's employer, Lancet Financial. It wasn't considered one of the big players like Fidelity or Bain. It was exactly the kind of place an ambitious young man like Kyle Banning would use as a stepping stone before moving on to one of the big hedge funds. I wasn't sure exactly what he did for the company. His degree in economics was from Princeton. I was not sure what that prepared you for, but it sounded impressive. The company occupied the top 3 floors of a building in Lower Manhattan on Canal Street. It used to be some sort of warehouse, and they'd kept the working-class facade on the outside, but the inside was quite trendy. Soft lighting and expensive prints on the walls. A terrarium covered the center of the big lobby. A small palm tree and other tropical plants filled the climate-controlled glass hut. I walked directly into one of the elevators and hit the button for the 8th floor like I knew where I was going. No one in the lobby gave me a second look. Exactly why I dressed a little nicer today. I was wearing my favorite blue sport coat with some nice Pierre Cardin slacks. I thought a suit might be overdoing it. The elevator opened to the reception area of Lancet Financial. An attractive young woman looked up from her computer and smiled as I approached the desk. I had debated whether I should identify myself or just ask to see Kyle Banning. Just as the young woman asked if she could help me, I saw Kyle Banning walking down the hallway directly toward me. I smiled at the young woman and said, "Never mind. Here's the man I need to talk to real quick." Banning looked up, and I stuck out my hand. I said, "Kyle Banning? I'm Michael Bennett. Can we talk in your office for a minute?" I appreciated the confusion on Kyle Banning's face. I thought he recognized me but couldn't put his finger on why I seemed familiar. Exactly why I hadn't brought Terry Hernandez with me on this interview. He would definitely remember her. "Do I know you, Mr. Bennett?" "I don't believe we've ever met officially." I turned slightly, hoping to lure him away from the receptionist. He followed my lead and started to walk with more purpose, so I followed him. A few doors down from the reception area, we turned into a small but comfortable office with a view of Lafayette Street, where I could just make out the front of 11 Howard, a boutique hotel a block away. I reached over and pushed the door shut so we were alone in the room. The movement seemed to startle Banning. I pulled out my badge and ID. I said in my best official voice, "I'm a homicide detective with the NYPD. I'd like to ask you a few questions." Banning looked at me and said, "Am I under arrest?" "No." "Then I don't have to answer your questions. Is that correct?" I didn't answer. It didn't sound like I needed to. Banning said, "It's not my policy to talk to the police while I'm at work. I'm paid by the Lancet Corporation to do my job while I'm in this building. I'm paid quite well, and I'm very effective at my job. What I'm not paid for is to chat with public employees. I'm afraid I'm going to have to ask you to leave." This was not turning out the way I'd expected, but I didn't move. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard my grandfather's voice. Kyle Banning was a bully, and I was going to stand up to him. Banning said, "Did you hear me? I'm asking you to leave. Right now you're trespassing. If you don't leave, I might even call the NYPD to escort you out of the building. I wonder how embarrassing that would be for you." I didn't want to tip my hand or give him any ammunition to accuse me of harassment. I swallowed my anger and nodded, but had to throw in, "Perhaps we'll meet again soon." I backed out of his office like I was expecting to be shot from behind if I turned. Banning had a smug grin on his face as he said, "I doubt it," then slammed his office door in my face. I endured a few stares as I marched out of the office. Chapter 43. I left Lancet Financial and drove up the Henry Hudson heading out of Manhattan. It wasn't a trip I particularly wanted to make. I was going to meet with Suzanne Morton's parents at their home in Yonkers. I was trying not to let emotion dictate my actions. Sure, I was pretty hot about the way Kyle Banning had dismissed me. I needed some real evidence to confront him with, something that would get his full attention. On the flip side, I hadn't given up any details of the investigation, or even the fact that he was a suspect. I easily found the Mortons' lovely 2-story brick home in the middle of Yonkers. Sometimes it's hard for me to wrap my head around a neighborhood so close to the city comprised of just houses. I couldn't see any high-rises in the distance. Visits like this make me question my reasons for still living in the city with so many children. I saw David Morton sob in the driveway and knew he'd probably stayed home from work just to talk to me. I'd contacted them a few days before, asking if I could meet with them. After Banning cut our interview so short, I'd called to see if they could talk to me this morning. I'd kept my reasoning vague. I even had made it sound like I was just checking on them as a friend. That's a shady thing to do. That's why I intended to check on them while I interviewed them. Rachel Morton offered me coffee as we sat in the downstairs living room. There were pictures of the family all over the walls and on tables. 2 parents, beautiful Suzanne and her younger brother Paul. Disney World, the Empire State Building, somewhere out west with mountains. They were smiling in all of them. I hoped they'd be able to find those smiles again someday, but I knew it wouldn't be any time soon. I checked for subtle signs of emotional distress while I spoke to David and Rachel Morton. Rachel's eyes were rimmed with red, and David appeared to be under the influence of prescription pills. His speech was slurred, and sometimes he seemed to just stare straight ahead while Rachel answered my few questions. Then she asked, "I thought Detective Stanton from New Rochelle was handling this case. Why are you asking questions?" "I'm just helping Detective Stanton out. I didn't want to complicate matters or upset them further by suggesting their daughter might have been the victim of an active serial killer. Once I had proof, I could talk to them about it." Suzanne had mainly lived in the NYU dorms, but I asked to see her room at home. Rachel told me Detective Stanton had already looked through it, but it had taken him only about 10 minutes. That annoyed me. 10 minutes wasn't enough time to find anything. It appeared to be a typical young person's room. Suzanne had a planner from last year on her wall. A rope chair hung from the ceiling. A couple of framed photos showed her with girlfriends at Coney Island and a few other places. One photo had Juliana in it. There was nothing at all unusual about her room. Rachel Morton told me about their efforts to get into Suzanne's iCloud account, but so far they had no luck. Apple essentially refused the deal with the police. Suzanne didn't appear to have written down her passwords anywhere. It was an awkward situation. Technically, I was not assigned to this homicide. It wasn't even within the NYPD. It wasn't like I could take Suzanne's computer back to my office and have our forensic people look through it. That would cause far too many questions. I was afraid Bill Suicide Stanton wasn't as dogged in the investigation as I would have liked him to be. That's when I had an idea. Were Suzanne and her brother close? Rachel Morton shrugged. They're a little over 3 years apart. I never considered them close, but they didn't fight all the time like some siblings do. Just then, Paul padded out of his bedroom, probably for the first time today. I called his name, and he slowly walked backward till he was in the doorframe. He didn't appear to be surprised to see a stranger in his house. He just stared at me, waiting for my question. He wore a thick terry-cloth Stony Brook robe that hung open over shorts and a Green Day retro t-shirt. I said, "Any idea how to get into your sister's iCloud account? You don't have her username and password, do you?" He mumbled, "Always, capital S, U-Z-E, capital M. And she used to use Cheer123 for most of her passwords. Try that." He couldn't have had less enthusiasm in his voice. He shuffled away from the door as soon as he'd answered. I typed in the details and had instant access to Suzanne's voluminous iCloud account with all her photos. I was about to ask Rachel Morton if I could look through the account from my office. I wanted her to know exactly what I was doing. Then, about the 20th photo in, I stopped and took a closer look. It was a picture of Suzanne at some kind of party, and Kyle Banning was standing right next to her, smiling. Chapter 44. This new photo of Kyle Banning with Suzanne Morton was a bombshell. I needed help. I emailed the photo to Walter Jackson as I raced back to my office from the Mortons' house in Yonkers. Police work isn't a solitary activity. It's a team sport. That's why we have specialists. People like Walter who know where to find any piece of information. Our tech unit can break down any computer or internet issue like it's magic. And sometimes, you just need smart people to bounce some ideas off of. That's why I called Terry Hernandez, Walter Jackson, and my lieutenant, Harry Grissom. Terry agreed to meet all of us at the Manhattan North Homicide Office so everyone could listen to what I had so far on the case. We were still focusing on the two victims from the city. Suzanne Morton was in the mix, but we had plenty to do, and Suzanne was still a New Rochelle case. We met in Walter's office, which was the largest. He'd earned it through his hard work. As I stepped inside, I was reminded how important it was for him to have some space. Files, books, and logs were in neat piles on shelves around the walls. The office was a testament to a working intelligence analyst. Walter already had information on the case spread out over his desk, a long table, and even some stacks of paper on the floor. There were a few photographs on top of some papers and warrant requests. He had printed out the photo of Kyle Banning and Suzanne Morton that I'd emailed him. Walter looked up and smiled. "I'm getting a good start on creating a timeline for this guy. I've already figured out where the photo you sent me was taken. You can see the sign in the corner. The Dead Rabbit down on Water Street in the financial district. It's kind of famous for hosting holiday parties where all the financial people mingle and show off their significant others." Walter continued. "They hosted an early Halloween party for their regular customers on the second Friday night in October. The owner said in a Village Voice article that he likes to beat the rush on Halloween parties. That means this photo is about 4 weeks old, or just about the time Suzanne Morton went missing." Walter nodded. "Exactly." He walked us through a few more of his findings. Terry Hernandez stepped in a few minutes later, followed by Harry Grissom. I explained my disastrous initial contact with Kyle Banning. I could tell Terry was a little miffed I hadn't called her to come with me, even after I explained my reasoning that Banning could identify her from the bar. Walter had one more interesting piece of information. He held up a NCIC criminal history for Banning. It looked like the only arrest was for assault against Celia Cartwright. We knew that case had never been filed. I had to say, "I'm sorry, Walter, I don't see what you're talking about." Walter held up the page and showed me an extra indent on the side where there should be information, but there wasn't. Walter said, "I've seen this before. It's something that was expunged when he was a minor. It must have been something pretty serious to have even made it onto the NCIC printout. Sometimes I've noticed this discrepancy when crimes have been expunged through the legal system. It's almost as if the FBI created a back door to warn law enforcement about a serious issue with an individual. I said, I guess it's one more thing I can ask Banning when I interview him. Probably the easiest way to figure out what happened. We could track it down, but it may not be that important. Harry sat in a hard wooden chair, flexing his left knee and right hand. That was a habit he had developed in the last couple of years, because it made his arthritis feel a little better. When I finished going through everything I had on the case and Walter added the information he had developed, Harry looked off into the distance as he nodded his head. Harry said, I'm impressed with the information you've gathered already, but we're not about to get a conviction for homicide based on a couple of photographs. I agree it can't be a coincidence that this guy Kyle Banning knew 2 different murder victims, but that's not going to sway a judge when we try to get a warrant. I said, I'm going to take another shot at interviewing him. Did he ever ask for an attorney? No. He said it was his policy not to talk to the police at work, so I intend to surprise him at home tomorrow. Terry asked, Do you want to do surveillance to figure out the best time to catch Banning at home? I smiled. I already had a plan. Chapter 45. I explained my idea to the 3 solemn faces sitting around the table. Harry Grissom and Terry Hernandez were a little skeptical. Basically, it just involved interviewing Kyle Banning at his house on a Saturday morning. This Saturday morning. Tomorrow. I knew the building where Kyle Banning lived. It had a doorman and decent security. My first hurdle was figuring out how to get to Banning without giving him advance notice. If I identified myself to the doorman, he'd make a quick call up to the apartment. Banning would say he didn't want to see me at all. That was something I needed to avoid. As soon as Harry Grissom reluctantly agreed to my plan, I went to my best source for finding out about the Banning's doorman, Ronald Higdon, Esquire. Ronald gave me a big smile when I stepped through the pawn-shop door. Bennett, thank you again for getting that Detective Matthews off my back. You can thank me by saying you found a way to help me get in the building I told you about. Ronald waved like it was no issue at all. I called my boy Artie, who knows Midtown and the park. He got a hold of one of his delivery buddies named Sully, who knows a lot of the doormen. Anyway, the doorman at the building owes a friend of Sully's a fair amount of cash. That came from some bad business decisions involving the Jets and the Patriots. So Sully worked out a deal where his buddy is giving the doorman an extra week to come up with the cash if he lets you slip into the building. Simple. I appreciated the work Ronald had put in on this. It was too bad he always tried to go for the quick buck. He might have made a decent detective if he'd had some integrity. As it was, at least he was doing his part for law enforcement. I said, And what is this amazing feat of assistance going to cost me? Ronald was quiet for a moment. That was unusual. It made me nervous. He had already thought this through. Just a favor. Whenever I need it. What kind of favor? You know I can't do anything crazy. Unlike you, I have to follow a lot of rules. Ronald shrugged. I don't know yet what kind of favor. I just want to know you'll come if I call. I won't ask you to alter records or anything that would get you in trouble. I agreed and we shook on it. He knew I'd never breach an agreement like this. I already felt a twinge of concern about what I had just agreed to. Ronald gave me the information about the doorman at the Bannings building. He even had the man's schedule. I quickly smiled to see he was working Saturday morning. I was proud of the amount of progress my team had made today. I just hoped it paid off tomorrow morning. Chapter 46. My Friday evening was busy. I'll confess I was a little distracted while coaching the first girls' basketball game of the season for Holy Name, a game with a small Presbyterian school from Midtown. I tried to concentrate on my duties as a coach, but my mind wasn't focused on sports. All I could think about was tomorrow morning's interview with Kyle Banning. The crowd was festive. Keeping in mind that about a quarter of the crowd on the Holy Name side of the bleachers was my family, it was a nice atmosphere. I noticed Bridget cheering loudly for her twin. It made me smile the way only a daughter can make a father smile. I had to rein in Fiona a bit. I'd never seen her like this. She was trying to psych up her teammates, but starting to sound a little like an NBA head coach screaming at his team. I stepped in and placed a hand on my daughter's shoulder. "Hey, Pat Riley, back off a little bit. This is the first game. Just a chance for you guys to scrimmage against someone besides one another. Show good sportsmanship, use the skills you've learned in practice, and most importantly, have some fun." Fiona didn't look particularly happy with my goals. She wanted to crush our opponents. I was just looking for 32 minutes of fun for both teams. In the bleachers, Mary Catherine tried to start a wave. It didn't even make it all the way through my family, but I smiled when I saw Sister Sheila sitting a few feet from my family join in the wave. Seamus sat directly behind the bench. He was my unofficial assistant coach, along with Sister Elizabeth. His main job was to make sure the girls drank water and had clean towels. Sister Elizabeth's experience in college basketball dictated our lineup and strategy. I noticed my son Brian come in and join the family just as the game started, still wearing his air conditioning company shirt. That made me smile. Then Juliana came in behind him. She was in a form-fitting dress and looked like she was going out after the game. Her long dark hair was tied in a straight ponytail that hung down her back. I couldn't believe this was the little girl who used to like to jump in the mud in the park near our building. Seeing Juliana made me think of Suzanne Morton. I wondered if Suzanne had gone to her brother's events. I thought about how the Mortons were handling Suzanne's death. I pictured them sitting in their nice home in Yonkers, fixating on what they had lost. I hoped it wouldn't be to the exclusion of their son, Paul. That happens more often than you'd think. A family loses a child, then they drift away from the children still in the house. It's a tragedy piled on top of tragedy. Then a basketball whizzed right past my head. It snapped me back to reality. Here I was thinking about parents ignoring children, while I was ignoring my own child. I focused back on the game as Fiona leapt into the air and sank a basket. It wasn't exactly a dunk, but it was incredibly athletic. I couldn't believe it. The crowd went wild. About a fourth of the crowd went extra wild. Chrissy held up a sign she'd been waiting to show. It was on white poster board with giant colorful letters saying, "Fiona shoots and scores." Everything came together at once for me. My daughter Fiona excelling. My family here to support us. The kids making posters for their sister. Who could ask for anything more? I guess I could. I badly wanted to have a good interview with Kyle Banning and charge him with murder. Chapter 47. I woke up early Saturday morning. A tingle of anxiety ran through me at the prospect of interviewing Kyle Banning. That's right. I was excited to work. Show me a detective who doesn't get pumped up about a good case, and I'll show you a detective who doesn't clear a lot of cases. I drove past the building on Fifth Avenue where Banning lived with his parents. I was treating this like some sort of narcotic surveillance. I drove past it again. I wanted to know alleys and back entrances, foot traffic in front of the building, everything. I stashed the car a few blocks away and walked back past Madison to the building. The building had a spectacular view of Central Park, but especially the reservoir directly in front of it. This was one of the areas where old money lived, or at least people who'd had money in the 1980s. Now you had to be some kind of ungodly celebrity or tech tycoon to have an apartment in a building like this. The doorman Ronald Higdon Esquire had told me about stood in front of the building. His name was Dorian. He was tall, with an extra 50 pounds wrapped around his waist. He wore a traditional doorman's uniform and stood just outside the ornate entrance to the luxury apartment building. He looked a little on the nervous side. I wondered if it was because he knew I was coming. I told Ronald I'd be at the building between 10 and 12 on Saturday morning. I approached the hulking man, who appeared to be in his mid-40s. The little rim of hair he had around a bald head was already graying. He noticed me almost immediately. I approached him with a smile and wave. I said, "Are you Dorian?" The immense man hustled down the 5 steps to meet me on the sidewalk. He had a Brooklyn accent and held out a hand with pudgy fingers to stop me. You Ronald's friend?" He whispered it like someone inside the building might hear him. I nodded. "I left the back door open. I can't risk you being seen on a security video in the lobby, just in case somebody complains. People pay a lot of money to have peace of mind in this place. But I needed the favor Ronald worked out for me. I'm just glad you're not here to collect from me." "What do you mean collect?" "Ronald said you were collecting a debt. That if I didn't let you in, maybe you'd be collecting from me. I'm not here to break anyone's fingers. I'm a cop. I'm just trying to do a surprise interview." This seemed to confound Dorian. He gave me an odd look and then glanced up at the building, like he was trying to figure out who I might be talking to. Dorian turned back to me and shook his head. "I don't know. I'm not sure I can let a cop in. Let me get this straight. You were okay with me if I was going to break someone's arm if they didn't pay, but you wouldn't let in a cop on official business? You've got some screwed up values." Clearly, Dorian realized his extension on his gambling debts was based on me getting into the building, not what I did for a living. Finally, he said again, "The back door is unlocked. Go back the way you came, turn left behind the building. The door is directly across from the back door to the building behind us." I made sure to give the doorman a good stern glare before I left. To a guy like Dorian, it didn't matter if I was investigating a homicide, child molestation, or parking tickets. He didn't want to be seen helping the police. I slipped through the unlocked metal door in the remarkably clean and orderly alley. Nothing littered the asphalt and no graffiti scarred the walls. I took the service elevator to the top floor. It didn't say penthouse, but that's what it had to be. When I got off, I noticed there were only 2 doors. Each apartment must have a phenomenal view of the reservoir. I knocked on the Bannings' door casually, hoping whoever was inside would think it was Dorian. A woman about 50, wearing yoga pants and a loose t-shirt, opened the door wide and looked surprised to see me standing there in a coat and tie. I said, "Mrs. Banning?" She smiled and nodded. The bangs of her light hair almost hung to her eyes. I kept my cheerful used car salesman smile and said, "I talked with Kyle the other day. I just wanted to show him something. Vague and friendly gets you into a lot more places than stern and official. Both cops and vampires have to be invited into a home before they can enter, so I threw in. May I come in?" She motioned me inside and said, "Of course." I knew her manners would kick in before her sense of caution. As I stepped across the threshold, I realized I'd cleared my first hurdle. I was inside the apartment. Chapter 48. My hands felt clammy as I took in my surroundings. There was a whole lot that could go wrong with this plan. Now that I was inside the Bannings' apartment, I knew I had only a few minutes. My goals were simple. Find Kyle Banning and start talking. Who knew what could happen next? Thanks to Walter Jackson, I had a fair amount of information about the family. A 16-year-old brother named Jaden also lived at the house. The mother, Joan Banning, had just let me in and was still in the friendly chatty mode. The father had been a wildly successful attorney and now seemed to be winding down his career as general counsel for a major insurance company. I'd read an article about him that insinuated he got the job as part of a settlement with the same company. It didn't sound ethical, but I wasn't in a position to judge ethical behavior right now. I had just fooled my way past a trusting woman. Essentially, I was trespassing. Then, things broke my way. A shirtless Kyle Banning came out of a side bedroom, clearly having just woken up. He rubbed his eyes, then brushed his light brown hair out of his face. I couldn't help but notice his ripped physique. He had an honest-to-God 8-pack for a stomach with good biceps and broad shoulders. His mother turned and looked at Banning. She still had a smile on her face, until her son said to me, "What the hell? I thought I already told you to get lost." I said in a friendly tone, "Actually, you said it was your policy not to speak to the police at work. I assumed that meant I could talk to you here." His mother was obviously no stranger to dealing with police officers. She realized she'd made a serious error. But I was already in the apartment. I had nothing to lose. I said to Banning, Give me 15 seconds. Let me show you 2 photographs, and then if you think it's smart for me to leave, I will. Simple as that. No other obligation for you other than looking at 2 simple photographs. Banning was frustrated, but couldn't pass up a fair deal like that. Maybe it was the financial analyst in him. The easiest way to solve a problem was usually the most direct. I was a problem I was sure he wouldn't mind getting out of his life. That's why I wasn't surprised when Banning made a curt motion for me to follow him into a den. I'll admit that when I walked into the room, the view took my breath away for a moment. I could see from one side of the reservoir to the other. I could even see people relaxing in the park on a Saturday morning. I didn't waste any time. I reached into my pocket for the 2 photographs Walter Jackson had printed out for me. I stepped over to a walnut desk with legs that were hand-carved with decorative maple leaves. It made each leg of the desk look like a small tree. Banning stepped over to me. He looked down at the 2 photos. In one, he was posing with Suzanne Morton. In the other, he was standing next to Estella Abreu. The young man studied the photos for a moment, then looked up at me and said, "So what? I'm in photos at parties. I didn't do anything wrong." I took a moment to gather my thoughts and say exactly what I thought would hit home. In both of these recent photos, you're in the company of women who subsequently became homicide victims. Do you know what the odds are of knowing 2 different murder victims? I was wondering if you could explain this. Kyle Banning was clearly uncomfortable and fumbled for words. What do you mean, homicide victims? That sentence only has one meaning. These 2 women were both found dead not too long after you were seen with them at parties. Now I was starting to gear up to hit him with some questions about his whereabouts and how he knew the girls. I felt like my ploy had worked perfectly. Then a shadow fell across the doorway. I turned that way to see a man in his late 50s wearing slacks and an Izod shirt. His graying comb-over didn't do him any favors. The man said, "Kyle, don't say another word." He pointed his right index finger at me. "You need to leave right now." Chapter 49. Mr. Banning glared at me from the doorway and used his excellent authoritarian voice to get his point across. A teen, I assumed to be the little brother Jaden, stood behind the father, trying to see what was going on. Mr. Banning looked directly at me and said, "This interview and future interviews are over. Kyle wants an attorney." Banning whined, "But Dad, you don't understand, this is—" His father cut him off with a raised hand before Banning could finish his sentence. I imagined he had done that a lot when the boys were young. The move clearly terrified them. I based that assumption on the fact that Banning shut his mouth the second the hand went into the air. His father said, "No, Kyle, you don't understand. A cop like this doesn't care about rights or privacy. He just wants to clear a case." That's when I spoke up. "Yes, sir. That's right. I'm trying to solve the murders of several young women, and your son is in photos with 2 of them not long before they were killed." I held up the photographs. Now Jaden stepped closer to look at the photos. His green eyes grew wide. "Who got murdered?" Mr. Banning focused on me and said, "Crime like that is not our concern." Kyle looked at me and said, "It's not what you think. They were just arm candy. Hell, my little brother even took one to a dance." I asked, "One what?" Now Mr. Banning stepped between me and the boys. He wasn't big. In fact, the top of his head didn't quite come up to my nose. But he was imposing. Jaden Banning said again, "Who was murdered?" He looked at the photos with the fascination of a kid about to get on a roller coaster. His father snapped, "Jaden, get out of here." Then he turned to his older son and said, "Don't you ever learn? Keep your mouth shut, tight." He turned to me in a much lighter tone. He said, "Detective," and held his arm out to usher me from the room. "Joan, please show the detective out. I need to talk with Kyle," he said to Mrs. Banning. I followed Mrs. Banning to the front door. She was clearly nervous. Maybe scared was a better word. I could imagine what she'd been through with Kyle. Joan Banning said, I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding, Detective. You know how boys will be boys. My boys are just a little more intense. Jaden is still recovering from an illness that kept him out of school a few days, she said. I know about Kyle's arrest for striking the woman near Times Square. Why not try that? I had nothing to lose. He was never officially charged. I even know about his arrest as a juvenile. Even though I didn't actually know shit about that arrest, the effect on Mrs. Banning was remarkable. She sputtered and fumbled for words. Then she said, "We're not making the same mistakes with Jaden. We've been much stricter with him. In fact, that's why we have him in the Wolfson Academy up in Bronxville. He usually lives there during the week. I think it has really matured him." Now we were standing just outside the door to their apartment in the wide hallway. I turned to face Mrs. Banning. "What do you know about your son's dating life?" Now she looked really flustered. She looked over her shoulder to make sure her husband hadn't heard the question. I found myself leaning forward, anticipating the answer. Instead, Mrs. Banning took a step backward into the apartment and shut the door carefully. Chapter 50. Thank goodness being around my kids chased away any regrets I had about my fumbled interview with Kyle Banning and his family. Sunday is always family day in the Bennett household. Picnics, playing tourist in New York City by climbing to the top of the Empire State Building, or rowing boats across the lake in Central Park. Or if the weather is bad, board games inside. It doesn't matter. Today was definitely an outside day. You grab those when you can this time of year in New York City. Clear and in the mid-50s, perfect for some sort of outdoor game. I'd lain awake much of the night replaying the interaction with the Banning clan. My quick assessment, without any background or context, was that Banning's father was an asshole. His comment about a homicide investigation being none of their concern told me everything I needed to know about Mr. Banning. The mother was just trying to stay afloat. I'd seen it before. Stuck with a husband who had no idea what being involved with the family meant. Two entitled boys who thought they could get away with anything. And probably a conscience that kept her awake at night thinking about that. Kyle Banning had actually sounded like he wanted to talk to me if his old man wasn't around. He looked both bothered and surprised to hear about the deaths of Estella Abreu and Suzanne Morton. I searched for any connections between Kyle Banning and Emma Schrade. I could find nothing linking the dead Juilliard student found in the Bronx with my suspect. But it was Kyle Banning's younger brother Jaden who had worked his way into my subconscious. The way he'd looked at the photos of the girls. The fascination. I didn't want to think about a teenage serial killer, but something told me it was a possibility. Call it a hunch or instinct or whatever you want. It was Jaden Banning I felt I needed to look at more closely. His mother had mentioned a place called the Wolfson Academy in Bronxville. I did some research after I left the Banning residence. The Wolfson Academy's motto was, "We turn problems into success." I knew the academy had to be expensive, because there was no hint of prices on their website. There were photos of young men dressed in sharp military-style uniforms. Everyone's hair was cut short. Each cadet appeared to be in perfect physical condition. To me, sending your kid away to a boarding school was the last possible resort. You didn't end up at a place like that without a solid reason. I didn't want to think about the methods the Wolfson Academy used to fix young people. As I lay in bed on Sunday morning, considering the day ahead of me, Mary Catherine turned and put her hand on my chest. "You were restless last night. Everything okay?" I told her about my interaction with the Banning family. I also told her about the younger boy Jaden. I didn't hold back anything. Mary Catherine whistled. "It's scary to think that a young man could be hiding such a horrible secret. What causes behavior like that? It's not really video games, is it? If anyone figured out what caused this kind of behavior, maybe we could act to curb it. I don't have any evidence this kid is a killer. It's just an idea that concerns me. Imagine a boy capable of such terrible things. If he picked up one of our girls on a date and we didn't know him." Mary Catherine couldn't bring herself to finish the sentence. I was glad she didn't. Mary Catherine cuddled up next to me. "Michael, Sometimes I just get so worried. This is exactly what scares me about having another child. Hearing about a boy who could go so wrong. A boy capable of hurting people. The world is a scary place. I squeezed her and kissed Mary Catherine on the top of her head. I had the same thoughts all the time. Chapter 51. Our schedule was a little off for a Sunday. My grandfather had organized a spaghetti dinner at Holy Name tonight. We were going to the evening service, so our Sunday game day could start earlier than usual. The kids whipped through breakfast and helped with cleanup. It was nice not rushing out to church on a Sunday morning. I wondered why that never happened during the week when we were late for school. But it was still nice seeing smiles and everyone dressed in shorts and sweatshirts for a day of hard playing. Brian suggested we go to Central Park, but I knew I'd be constantly turning to look at the Bannings' apartment building. It would just be a distraction for me. Instead, before I said anything, Mary Catherine suggested the much more convenient Riverside Park. Chrissy jumped up and down, clapping her hands. She loved to look for birds in the bird sanctuary section of the park. I liked some of the park's wide-open fields. We walked as a group the few blocks to the park. We no longer made each kid hold hands with the one in front of him or her. But there was an unwritten rule that the older kids keep track of the younger kids. Still, a mob of 10 kids and 2 adults marching down the street could startle the unsuspecting. Usually people just assumed we were some sort of school out on a field trip. That was fine with me. Some of the older kids and I carried backpacks holding a dozen different balls and rackets and bats, as well as a picnic. We've learned it's easier to just buy drinks from a street vendor than carry a cooler along with us. The logistics were not unlike moving an army across occupied territory. You need to know what supplies are available and what to bring with you. Mary Catherine said, "What do you guys think? Maybe basketball?" Trent and Ricky immediately said, "Football," in unison. I was sure it had to do more with them not wanting to be embarrassed by Fiona dropping 15-foot jumpers on them than any great love of football. It didn't matter. A quick voice vote approved the measure, and after a leisurely walk past the bird sanctuary to make Chrissy happy, we found ourselves on a field rimmed by a few shade trees. We fell into natural teams of 6-on-6. It wasn't always the exact same teams. There were 4 or 5 variations. Each of us had our advantages. I was tall enough to see over everyone if I was quarterback. That's why they made the rule I couldn't be quarterback anymore. Trent was much faster than everyone else. He used it to his advantage to outrun the coverage. The problem with that was he couldn't catch particularly well. It was still fun to see the ball sail toward him so far down the field. Even Chrissy had an advantage. She was so small and quick, she could dart between us before anyone could tag her. When she managed to bend almost to the ground to avoid a tag by Ricky, her brother yelled, "That's not a legal move! Her knee touched the ground! I'm calling for an official ruling!" It was my oldest daughter, Juliana, who set her brother straight. "Keep it to yourself, Belichick!" I laughed out loud. Anyone who was even remotely a Jets fan always had to take their shots at the New England Patriots. The game ended when Fiona threw a pass to Trent. He bobbled it, and Jane snatched it right out of the air, then ran almost the entire field to score. Admittedly, our field was only about 30 yards long, but it was still impressive. We marched back to the apartment, cleaned up, went to the evening service at Holy Name, and then sat down to the church's spaghetti dinner. Ricky was critical of the store-bought tomato sauce, but said the decent garlic bread made up for it. Brian said it reminded him of going to school here at the church, and had 3 helpings of spaghetti. I leaned back at the table where my entire family, including my grandfather, was seated. I listened to the jokes and laughter, and wondered if life got much better than this. I doubted it. Chapter 52. Monday morning was back to reality. Time to find answers to all the questions that had nagged me over the weekend. That required a drive for my first bit of business, specifically, a drive north about 15 miles to the village of Bronxville in Westchester County. I wanted to get a good look at the Wolfson Academy and maybe even Jaden Banning. My intention was mainly to walk through the school. I figured if I showed up as a concerned parent of a troubled young man, I might get a quick tour. Places like that always need cash, and rarely turn anyone away, unless they can't pay. Driving into the small, well-kept village, it was hard for me to believe this was one of the most expensive suburbs of a major city in the country. There was nothing to it. I found the Wolfson Academy 6 acres filled with aged oak and pine trees next to a country club off White Plains Road. It looked like a small college campus. The main administrative building faced the street and rose 3 stories. 2 buildings ran perpendicular to the admin building, so the 3 buildings together formed a giant U. I strolled straight up the long walkway, trying to give the impression that I was casually interested in the institution. Someone buzzed me through the front door, where a receptionist met me. I told her my name, and that I was interested in a tour for my 3 sons. I guess being dressed in a nice coat and wearing a tie conveyed some sort of gravitas. Plus, the prospect of 3 new students at once had to be appealing to a school like this. The next thing I knew, I was meeting with the headmaster, Charles Tilton III, or as he asked to be called, Trey. Trey immediately asked me what I did for a living. I didn't lie. I said, I work for the NYPD. That gave the man in his mid-40s pause. He bit his lip and looked out the window. I knew what he was thinking. No way this guy can afford our tuition. The headmaster said, We have excellent academics. That's a reflection of the money we pour into the programs. Money that comes from tuition. So, you're saying you don't think I can afford this? No, not at all. Just offering a warning. I don't imagine the NYPD pays enough for the risks you have to take, and our tuition is high by other school standards. I don't mean to be rude or abrupt. I'm just trying to be honest. This was his way of covering all his bases. He didn't want some cop going back to the city saying they were a bunch of snobs who wouldn't take a civil servant's child. If he showed me around and I came to the realization myself that the tuition was too high, he knew I wouldn't have much to complain about. I said, I have other sources of income. He perked up like a lawyer who'd witnessed someone slip and fall at a McDonald's. He smoothed his perfect hair, then said, Let me show you our athletic facilities. Then you can decide if you're interested. He led me out of his office and down the hallway. We were passed by a number of young men in sharp uniforms. Each of them greeted us with a, Good morning, sir. Trey asked what I was looking for in a school. You said you had 3 sons. Are they giving you problems? I can't even begin to tell you. I couldn't, because there was nothing I could think of that my younger sons had done wrong. Trent, Ricky, and Eddie barely ever broke rules, let alone laws. Although I have to admit I'd thought the same thing about Brian, until he was arrested for drug dealing. In effect, I was walking through this place in an undercover role. The headmaster knew I was a cop, but he thought I was here on personal business. I'd let him keep believing that. The headmaster was slim and walked at a fast pace. Even with my long legs, I struggled to keep up with him. Everything about him was manicured and polished, a lot like the academy itself. We slowed our pace a few times to look through windows into classrooms. Each class had 20 or so students. I stayed on the lookout for Jaden Banning. Chapter 53. I kept my eyes and ears open as we continued the tour. I was hoping to pick up some kind of information or even a reference to Jaden Banning. I had to admit that with all the cadets dressed the same and all with short haircuts, I might not recognize Jaden if I only caught a glimpse. We swung back by the office on our way to the athletic fields. Just as we stepped inside, a professionally dressed woman came out of an office. The headmaster said, Jill, this is Mr. Bennett. He works for the NYPD. Is he here about the money? The headmaster quickly shook his head and said, No, that's the local police, not the NYPD. I didn't ask what she was talking about. I had my own investigation to conduct. As we cut through the rest of the main administrative offices, a woman sitting at a desk near the window looked up and smiled at me. Then she gave me a little wave. She was attractive and in her 40s with dark hair to her shoulders. I smiled and waved back as I followed the headmaster. She looked familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on where I knew her from. Once outside, we turned the corner of the building. The view of the fields and surrounding woods was spectacular. 2 baseball fields and an 8-lane quarter-mile running track ringed the football field. I watched some cadets run in formation around the track. The last one in the formation had to sprint to the front of the line. I remember doing something similar at the police academy. Thank God I'd never had to do it as a student at Holy Name. I smiled to myself, picturing Sister Sheila learning this new way to efficiently exercise. She'd love it. We crossed the running track once the cadets were past us, and headed towards a large man with blonde hair holding a tackling sled while 2 cadets in pads hit the sled. The big man noticed the headmaster and stepped away from the sled. He seemed even larger as he walked toward us. At least 6'5" and a solid 260, maybe in his mid-30s. The headmaster said, "Coach Martin, this is Mr. Bennett. He's looking at the school for his 3 teenage sons." The coach stuck out his beefy hand. "Perry Martin, nice to meet you." I said, "You have to get this all the time, but did you play pro football?" Coach Martin chuckled. "Technically, yes. Right guard at Syracuse and an undrafted free agent for Baltimore. Spent a year on their practice squad. Then realized I wasn't going anywhere in the NFL. Been here 6 years now, and it feels like home." The headmaster's phone rang, and he said, "Excuse me just a second." After Trey stepped away, the coach asked, "Do you live in Westchester County?" "The city." "I figured you had to live someplace like that if you could afford to send your kids here." "Do you have kids here?" Coach Martin laughed. "Even with the discount I get for working here, I could never afford to send a child here. Besides, mine are only 3 and 5. Doesn't the school offer scholarships?" "Generally in some sports, especially football. We've been the regional champs 5 years in a row. But the scholarships are also designed to promote diversity. I doubt your kids would qualify." I smiled, but didn't give him any details about my family. The headmaster finished his phone call and ambled back toward us. Coach Martin stuck out his hand again. "Hope you enjoy your tour, Mr. Bennett. And be careful down there in the city. It's not like up here in the suburbs where everything's quiet. You could get killed in the city." "You can get killed anywhere. At least I know my way around the city." Chapter 54. On the plus side, my tour was finished, and the headmaster hadn't suspected what I was really after. On the minus side, I really hadn't learned anything of value. I wasn't about to mention Jaden Banning's name. A place like this would immediately inform Mr. Banning, who would almost certainly claim some kind of harassment. That would make it much more difficult to determine if either of the Banning brothers was involved in the murder of Estella Abreu, Suzanne Morton, or Emma Schrade, who had been found in the Bronx. I was on my way to my car when I heard someone call my name. I turned to see the woman I'd vaguely recognized from inside the office. She hustled toward me as fast as her high heels could carry her. "Hi, Detective Bennett. Do you remember me?" I said, "I knew I recognized you." I hate to ever admit not remembering someone. "Michelle Finnegan." She read my blank stare and added, "My daughter Alyssa went missing when she was 10 years old, and you found her." I snapped my fingers. "The little girl who liked to ride buses. I found her on a bus headed from the Upper West Side to Midtown." She jumped up and gave me a hug. "I've been holding that in for 11 years. You were the only one who actually listened when we were telling you about Alyssa. You're the one who figured out the bus schedules and brought her home to me safe. I'll never forget that." "What's Alyssa up to now?" "She's a senior at Binghamton. She wants to work in transportation. Go figure." We both laughed together. It's moments like these that make every hardship a cop faces worthwhile. It doesn't take many successes like this to make you forget about the failures. We chatted for a few minutes. Michelle told me how much she'd enjoyed working at the school the past 4 years. I took a chance. "Can I ask you a question just between the two of us?" "Of course." "Do you know a student named Jaden Banning?" "I know all the students. Jaden a little better than the rest. He seems to find his way to the office frequently. He might be involved in something serious. That's why I'm really here. I was just seeing if I could pick up any information. Jaden is sort of famous around here. He brought an unbelievably beautiful girl as his date to a school dance some months ago. A little older. Really made an impression. That caught my attention immediately. Would the girl have had to sign a register or anything to go to the dance? Michelle Finnegan shook her head. She said, "Some of the boys were talking about the girl the next week. Apparently, when someone asked Jaden if she was his girlfriend, he said, 'No, my brother got me the girlfriend experience.'" The what? Apparently, she was an escort hired by Jaden's older brother. He's some kind of financial analyst in the city. She was a prostitute? I don't think so. More of a date for hire. I asked Alyssa if she'd ever heard the term. She said she had, but wasn't sure what it meant. This felt big. Huge. But I needed more. Is there any way, short of speaking to Jaden Banning or his brother, that I could identify this girl? Michelle pulled her phone from a pocket of the blue sweater she had on over her blouse. She started scrolling through her photos and said, "I may have a couple of photos of them. I took about 50 that night, mostly of decorations, but quite a few of the students as well." I waited while she scrolled through her photos. When she held up the phone, I had to squint and lean closer to see the photo clearly. Jaden Banning was smiling with his arm around Emma Schrade. Chapter 55. The girlfriend experience. The phrase pinged around in my head. It seemed familiar but alien at the same time. I used my phone to look it up and saw that it was a TV show and used on several adult sites to describe an escort pretending to be someone's girlfriend. Those kinds of general terms didn't seem like they would help me at the moment. I went to the best possible source of underground phrases, Ronald Higdon, Esquire. When I walked into Higdon's Pawn and Jewelry, I saw a young couple at the counter talking with Ronald. The way my informant looked up and said, "Good morning, Detective Bennett," told me he was warning the couple not to say anything they weren't supposed to in front of a cop. I was anxious to talk to him. I turned and looked at the front door. He took the hint and told the couple to come back later to finish their business. When we were alone, I asked Ronald, "What kind of conspiracy are you involved in with those two?" Conspiracy? They were just looking at rings. I'm offended you'd think I'd conduct any criminal activity in my business. I said, I'm offended you'd think I didn't realize you're constantly conducting criminal activity in your business. Ronald put on a pleasant smile and said, "Sounds like we should agree to disagree." Wisely, he changed the subject. "I poked around a little bit after you texted me. I think I've got some information on your girlfriend experience." I didn't say anything. Sometimes silence can be a great motivator. It clearly made Ronald a little uneasy. A lot of people, he stammered, use the term. But it's also the name of a little group here in Manhattan. I don't know how little, but it's not widespread. A group of young ladies who make money renting themselves out as dates. Sex is not always on the table. I heard that's negotiable. It sounds a little like prostitution. It's not like the old days, Bennett. No pimps involved, everything's online now. Very sophisticated. Sounds like these girls run it themselves. He looked on his phone, then said, I'm texting you a link to the site. I also talked to some of my people on the street. They've heard it was going on, but no one knows any of the girls involved. It sounds like they're pretty smart. I stood there for a moment, thinking about what Ronald had just told me. Ronald said, Think the girls who ended up dead were part of this girlfriend experience? I shook my head. Don't know. Maybe. Easiest way to find out would be to ask Kyle Banning directly. He's already said he won't talk to me. Or at least his father did. You probably don't want to involve one of your smart kids who know how to sail around the internet, do you? I looked at Ronald. That's a good idea. Using one of your kids on a murder investigation? What? No, of course not. But I know some pretty smart tech people who aren't related to me. I bet I know exactly which one would want to help. I turned on my heel and hustled for the door. Just as I opened it, I turned back and said, "Thanks, Ronald. Sometimes you're even helpful when you don't mean to be. For the purposes of payment from the NYPD, I always mean to be helpful." Chapter 56. The NYPD headquarters makes me uncomfortable. I've never liked being around one police plaza for very long. As far as I'm concerned, the place is a necessary evil, only visited if I want to talk to someone in special investigations or human resources, or our forensic tech people. That's why I didn't appreciate the fact that I had visited the place so many times in the past few days. I walked through the main door of the tech unit. It wasn't dark and dingy like TV shows often portray tech hubs, but I knew that some of the tech people preferred to work in a darkened room since it reduced glare. A young man looked out from behind his desk and said, "May I help you?" "Is William Patel here?" The young man pointed to a partially closed door, then went back to work, working on his computer without another word. William Patel had been a tremendous help when I was stuck in Washington, D.C., trying to find out who had killed my friend, FBI agent Emily Parker. Not only did William help me, he'd also done so without approval from the NYPD. He trusted that I needed help to find a killer, instead of listening to people who were trying to chase me out of Washington. The 10 by 20-foot room had 4 computers and the lights turned low. William was in the corner studying a screen filled with computer code. When he looked up to see who'd come in, his eyes looked bleary and bloodshot. It took a moment for him to recognize me. Then he perked up instantly. "Detective, what brings you to our little high-tech kingdom? Have another big case you need help with?" "You should be a psychic, William. That's exactly what I need." He got a big goofy grin on his face. He looked at me and said, "Put me in, coach." It was hard not to feel encouraged by an attitude like that, especially since I knew a lot of the tech guys took shit from other detectives. Some detectives viewed them as nothing more than nerdy administrative assistants. They were constantly trying to get the tech guys to bypass safeguards on their NYPD laptops, mainly software to keep them from downloading dangerous programs and viruses or to track their internet usage. I took the seat next to William and started to tell him what I'd learned about the girlfriend experience. I handed him an information sheet on each of my 3 victims, Emma Schrade, Estella Abreu, and Suzanne Morton. Each sheet had just their personal information, like their date of birth and their cell phone number. While I laid out the information as I knew it, William started to work on his computer. I told him what I knew about the case and my 2 suspects, Kyle and Jaden Banning. I pointed out to him that I had no evidence on either brother, or anyone else for that matter. He kept typing while occasionally glancing up at me. When I finally finished talking, I leaned back in the chair. "What do you think, William? Can you get me some kind of a line on this girlfriend experience? I know you're busy and it's tough to take time out of your day, but you told me you wanted to be involved in more interesting cases. When do you think you'd be able to help me?" William looked at me with no expression. I noticed his dark hair was longer than the last time I had spoken to him, and he wore a new pair of more fashionable glasses. "The stuff on the printer behind you has the best match I could find looking through some of the seedier parts of the internet," he said. "What?" "Reach behind you and take the sheets from the big laser printer." I turned in my chair and plucked 9 sheets of paper from a blocky printer. The top sheet was a printout of a New York State driver's license photo for an extremely pretty girl with long blonde hair. I didn't recognize her, but there was a list of several phone numbers below the photo, as well as a few addresses. I turned my eyes back to William, but kept silent. I knew any question I asked would sound stupid. William said, "I cross-referenced the phone numbers from the sheet you just gave me through a few sites the NYPD would not approve of. Anyway, it looks like your victims all used at least one phone number in common. It was probably some kind of a hub or a computer. The printouts I just gave you have all the information on the girl connected to that phone number. Her name is Allie Pritz. Looks like she used to go to NYU. She's got a lot of addresses attached to her name all over the city. Maybe she can tell you what you need to know." I was speechless. It actually scared me that someone could find out all that information in just a few minutes while still engaging with me and probably playing a video game at the same time. It also made me evaluate my past experiences at headquarters. Maybe I had expected too little. Between Gary Avram, Persephone Garland, and William Patel, I had been able to jump ahead with their quick assistance. Finally, I said, "William, I could kiss you." He held up both hands and said, "I'm really not interested in something like that, Detective. I'm not judging you or your choices. I'm just saying it's not for me." I was so anxious to work with the new information that all I said was, "Understood." Chapter 57. I went over the information William Patel had just given me. There wasn't much more here about Allie Pritz. She was 22, born in Philadelphia, never been arrested, attended NYU for 2.5 years. Now it seemed she was coordinating some kind of dating service. Normally, something I couldn't have cared less about. But if the members of this service were being murdered, I needed to learn more. Before I could plan my next move, I received a text from my grandfather, Seamus. One of the kids had told him texting was cooler than calling. Now he was a texting maniac. All it said was, "Can you swing by my office or call me?" My grandfather appreciated people's time and effort. He hated to disrupt their normal day if they were working, so a casual message like this meant something different coming from him. It was the equivalent of someone else shouting, "Come here right now." I texted him, "On my way." Even I was surprised how quickly I got uptown. When I stepped into his office in the administrative building next to the church and school, I immediately knew what the problem was. Trent, Eddie, and Ricky were all sitting around a small table in the corner of Seamus's office doing their homework. My grandfather didn't say anything. He didn't want to embarrass the boys. The first thing I asked was, "Is everyone okay?" My sons all nodded at the same time. Seamus said, "The boys had a run-in with the bullies again." I turned toward the boys. "I thought we agreed you'd stay away from those courts until we work this out." My grandfather interceded before the boys could speak. "It didn't happen down the street. The boys were right in front of the church." Trent blurted, "We were just across the street. Tommy Sosa said we were too chicken to leave the grounds and started running around with his hands under his arms, flapping his elbows and clucking like a chicken. What were we supposed to do?" I glanced over at my grandfather. Clearly he was concerned about the situation. But Trent's colorful explanation made him want to laugh. He was holding it in, and not doing a particularly good job of it. Even I'll admit I can remember being goaded into doing stupid things when I was a kid. I think boys are especially susceptible to taunting. Tommy Sosa had known exactly what buttons to push. I looked back at Trent. "It's okay. You're not in trouble. Just tell me what happened." There were a lot of starts and stops from all three boys. Basically, the same bullies who'd bothered them at the basketball courts had been walking down the street and saw them. The oldest boy shoved Trent to the ground. Then the one who had shown them the gun in his waistband pointed his fingers at Eddie like they were a pistol and mimed shooting. This was troubling on a number of levels. The threat of gun violence was the most alarming. I waited for the end of the story. What happened then? Where did the bullies go? Did any adults see it? Ricky shrugged his shoulders. "We ran back inside the fence around the school. We didn't see where the other boys went. I don't think anyone noticed us." Eddie appeared to be the most shell-shocked. He said, "Can I be homeschooled for a while? I'm tired of getting pushed around when I come to school." His tone said he was trying the joke, but I could tell he'd be happy to stay at home for a while. Ricky was much more brash. He said, "Don't you think it's time we stood up to them? I want to get my own gun." I held up my hands and said, "Don't say stupid things like that, Ricky." This is a problem that we can solve, but the first thing you need to do is stay on school property as discussed. Eddie said, "Is this why some people think the police don't help much? The police have to follow certain rules, even when our own family is involved." I looked at my grandfather and said, "Would we be able to get any footage from the security cameras at the front of the school?" Seamus smiled. "I already have a video file saved for you. You can see all 3 bullies clearly. It's a little harder to see what they were doing. That'll do for a start." I decided I needed to call it a day and drive the boys home in my city car. Chapter 58. Once I got home with the boys, I started getting texts from Walter Jackson. He'd found a few more possible addresses for Ali Pritz. 2 of the addresses were in Midtown, one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn. Plus I had the addresses William Patel had given me. It looked like I had a long day of checking addresses tomorrow. Just after dinner, I sat at the dining room table helping Chrissy with her history homework. She was studying the Dark Ages. It was generally basic stuff, like how most of Europe was in chaos and diseases like the Black Plague added to the misery. Chrissy looked at me with her big blue eyes and asked, "I don't understand what caused the Dark Ages." I'd been looking through her textbook to see if it included any details, but there were no real explanations. I said, "One theory is that as Rome withdrew from its outlying provinces, including Europe, organization and infrastructure broke down. Some people say there were no decent roads built for more than 500 years after the fall of Rome. Do you think that will be on the test?" I smiled. I undoubtedly had asked the same question of my grandfather when I was Chrissy's age. They were probably teaching history the same way they did when I was at Holy Name as a kid. No, sweetheart, I doubt that's anything you need to remember. That seemed to satisfy my youngest daughter. My 2 oldest daughters, Juliana and Jane, were also studying at the other end of the long dining room table. I'd learned over the last few years that my older children were on top of their academics. I had very little to add to most of their lessons. They were far beyond me in math and rolled in calculus too. They certainly didn't care about my opinions on historical questions. But I couldn't help one kid and then ignore the 2 others at the table. Chrissy jumped up from the table like a prisoner just released after 9 years in Attica. She darted out of the room, leaving me alone with Jane and Juliana. I moved down until I was sitting next to Jane and across from Juliana. I smiled and said, "What are we working on?" Jane gave me her famous flat stare and said, "I don't know what you're working on, but I'm working on American Lit. My essay is about how none of the great writers of the early 20th century would be published today." She added, "And how does that affect classics of the future? Are we as a society encouraging the arts? What impact would an artless society have on the future?" Any dad will tell you he doesn't want to look stupid in front of his kids. I feared it was unavoidable in this case. All I could do was mumble, "Okay, you sound like you have a handle on this." I wasn't cracking a joke, but it made both the girls laugh. We sat and chatted for a few minutes. The younger kids were always interested in telling me about their days and their projects. The older kids were more reticent. You had to hit them just at the right time. Jane told me about some experiments in her biology class that she found really interesting. Juliana told me about the acting class she took at City College in the evenings. Right now, they were breaking down Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night. I loved hearing about my girls' interests. Then Juliana turned serious and asked me, "Have you heard anything more about the investigation into Suzanne's murder?" Her voice got weak toward the end of the sentence, and I felt like she might start to cry. I looked into my daughter's beautiful face and realized I'd been searching everywhere for information when I had a potential source right in the apartment with me. She shared a lot of characteristics with Suzanne Morton. She might help. I said, "Have either of you ever heard of the girlfriend experience?" Juliana said, "You mean like the TV show?" "No, I mean from your friends or anyone in real life." Even with 10 kids, You quickly learn each of their little idiosyncratic mannerisms. In this case, I saw how Juliana's eyes focused on the table and she folded her hands across her writing pad. Ever since she was a little kid, that was a sign that she was keeping some sort of secret. After nibbling around the subject for a few minutes, I finally asked Juliana directly, "Juliana, sweetheart, I feel like you know something about this, but you don't want to talk about it. This is important. It may help us find Suzanne's killer." A tear leaked out of Juliana's left eye. She lowered her head and nodded silently. After almost a full minute, she said, "I've heard of it a couple of times. I know the girlfriend experience has something to do with getting paid to pretend to be someone's date at fancy parties or events. Someone asked Suzanne if that's how she had so much spending money. Suzanne blew off the question and didn't answer. But I can put it all together now. She did have a lot of extra cash and was always paying for our meals and rides. It also explains why she was never free to go out on Friday or Saturday nights." I nodded and made a few mental notes as my oldest daughter continued to talk. Suzanne used to tell me about her friend Allie, whom she worked with. I always thought that was a little odd since Suzanne had no official job. The mention of Allie caught my attention. "Do you have any idea where Allie lives?" "I think it's somewhere close to NYU. Suzanne once said she was going to get an apartment like Allie's. She hated living in the dorm." My daughter had just told me which address I would look at first when I tried to find Allie Pritz. Chapter 59. I was up early the next day. Juliana had given me an idea. I snuck out of the house before most of the kids were awake. As I suspected, I found Walter Jackson already in the office. I said, "You really are an early riser." The big man let out a laugh. "Come on, this is the only time during my day that it's quiet. No little girls begging me for ice cream. No detectives asking me to find out about old girlfriends or boyfriends. No lieutenant loaning me out to other units. I live for these 2 hours of undisturbed peace. That I'm about to disturb? That's why I have to ask you a question about silence." "What's that?" Walter said, "Why can't you hear a pterodactyl when he goes to the bathroom?" I groaned and was about to ask why, when at the last moment it hit me. Because the P is silent. That made Walter's day. He clapped and rolled back in his chair, laughing out loud. "I knew you'd start catching on one day." I told Walter about my conversation with Juliana the night before. It seems that these girls were all involved in the girlfriend experience. If that's the case, then we might be able to make a connection to the Bannings or another client. Walter started working his magic on the computer. I texted Emma Schrade's mother one simple question. I was wondering if you found out anything unusual about Emma's finances. Dr. Schrade called me less than a minute later. Yes, as a matter of fact. I was surprised to find out recently that she had almost $12,000 in a checking account. Her mother assured me Emma hadn't made that kind of money singing at weddings. I texted David Morton next. He also called me right back, and I went over the same question with him. We found $5,600 in cash hidden in her closet. There was silence on the line for a minute. Then I heard David Morton blow his nose. He came back on the line and said, "We told Detective Stanton. Didn't he share it with you?" "No." I kept the answer short. There was no telling what the New Rochelle detective thought was important. I thanked David Morton, then checked back in with Walter. I told him what I'd found out. It gives me some specific questions to ask Allie Pritz once we talk to her. Walter asked, "When do you think that will be?" "I'm hoping in the next couple of hours." Chapter 60. Less than 2 hours later, Terry Hernandez met me at a coffee shop near Washington Square Park. It was only a couple of blocks from the apartment where I believed Allie Pritz was living on Cornelia Street. Terry said, "I went by NYU yesterday and talked to the registrar. The registrar tried to help, but the only solid information they had was that Suzanne Morton barely attended class and had a poor GPA as a result. I nodded, then said, "Why would she stop worrying about classes? Because she wanted to be an actress and didn't think she needed a degree?" I shook my head. Or she was making so much money with the girlfriend experience, she didn't need to stay in college. I know she hadn't told her parents. They were clearly under the impression she was doing fine in school at the time she disappeared. We walked 2 blocks over to Cornelia Street. The building was a 5-story walk-up with a beautiful stone facade. The fire escape was along the side of the building, landing in an alley. It was still early enough that there was a chance we'd catch Allie Pritt snug in bed and surprised to find 2 New York City detectives knocking at her door. That might lead to some open discussion. That was our favorite phrase for scaring someone into talking. Terry walked up the 8 steps to the entrance. She checked the door buzzers. "I don't see her name, but there are 6 slots that just have numbers and no names." As I was considering what we should do, the door opened. A young man dressed in a sweatshirt looked at Terry and smiled. Then he held the door open for her. She just said, "Thanks," and stepped inside. The young man barely looked in my direction as he rushed down the steps and started to jog down the block. A moment later, Terry opened the door and let me in. Each of the 16 mailboxes had names on them. I saw the name Pritz for apartment 504. When I was a kid, Seamus used to tell me you can learn a lot about a building from the condition of its stairwell. If the stairwell is kept clean and in good order, the whole building usually is in the same shape. This stairway had the original hardwood handrail and steps. Each stair I took made a pleasing hollow thud that echoed in the stairwell. We took the stairs all the way to the top floor. We stepped out of the stairwell on the 5th floor into a wide corridor with an apartment on each side. Light streamed through a tall window with access to the fire escape. Apartment 504 was the one on the right. Terry knocked and stood in front of the peephole. Everyone knows that people are more likely to answer the door if a woman is knocking. A woman's scratchy voice asked, "Who is it?" Terry pulled her ID from her purse. She held the badge up to the peephole and said, "NYPD. We need to speak to you for a moment, Miss Pritz." The voice replied, "Give me a second to get dressed." In many ways, it was going better than I expected. It could have been the wrong address. Allie may not have been home. It could have been a mail drop. Instead, we got an immediate response. So why was I still uneasy? After about 45 seconds, I looked at Terry. She just shrugged and knocked on the door again. Nothing from inside. Then I heard a metallic scraping noise. I immediately recognized the sound of a fire escape brushing against the side of the building. I rushed to the window at the end of the hall. I saw a young woman in shorts and a t-shirt holding running shoes she hadn't had time to put on, carefully making her way down the outside fire escape. I unlatched the tall window and opened it. I looked out the window past the fire escape to the alley below. My fear of heights hit me like a sledgehammer. In an instant, I felt clammy sweat spring up on my face. My stomach twisted and I could taste my morning coffee in my throat. It was worse than I'd ever felt it in the past. Somehow I managed to gasp over my shoulder to Terry. "She's trying to climb down the fire escape." Terry didn't hesitate to sprint down the hallway and blast through the door to the stairwell. I had to suck it up and stepped out onto the fire escape with shaky legs. Chapter 61. I gulped a deep breath to follow Allie as she descended the fire escape. She moved quicker than I could. I could barely let go of the rungs as I tried to make my way down from the 5th to the 4th floor. I should have felt better as I moved closer to the ground. Instead, my palms got slick with sweat. I fought nausea with every step. Why was my dislike of heights hitting me so hard this time? Between the 3rd and 4th floors, I looked down and saw that Allie was nearly to the street level. My heart pounded as I tried to take each rung of the fire escape quickly but carefully. My foot slipped and I had to freeze in place for a moment. Finally, I gathered my nerve, closed my eyes, and kept going. As I cleared the second floor, I couldn't see anyone in the alley below me. Allie Pritz had hit the ground running, whether she was wearing the shoes or not. I got to the end of the fire escape and dropped the few feet to the asphalt alley. I suppressed the urge to vomit, then turned and sprinted toward Cornelia Street. I skidded to a stop as soon as I turned the corner. Terry Hernandez was standing on the sidewalk with her arms folded in front of her and a stern look on her face. On a foot-high planter near the building's entrance, Allie Pritz sat sheepishly, slowly putting on her Nike running shoes. Terry took one look at me and said, "You okay?" I couldn't speak. I just nodded my head. Terry said, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry I forgot about your acrophobia. I just acted on instinct and ran for the stairs." I waved her off. This was not exactly the first impression I wanted to make with a potential homicide witness. I looked at Allie Pritz still sitting on the edge of the planter. From this angle, she seemed incredibly young. I wondered if she knew what she had gotten herself into. I said, "Why'd you run? We only want to talk to you." She looked down at the sidewalk and mumbled, "I'm sorry. I just panicked." Terry said, "Do you know what we want to talk to you about?" "I can guess." Terry said, "You're not in any trouble. Go ahead and guess. We won't hold it against you." In a weak voice, Allie said, "You want to talk about the girlfriend experience, right?" That's when I said, "Actually, we'd like to talk to you about a series of homicides." That immediately got all of Allie Pritz's attention. Chapter 62. A few minutes after our short chase, we found ourselves back in Allie Pritz's apartment sitting around her breakfast counter. Allie had poured us each a glass of some kind of green antioxidant drink. Apparently the healthy Gen Z's version of coffee. All my vital signs had returned to approximately normal, although I knew I'd have visions of the fire escape as I was trying to fall asleep tonight. Allie had been badly shaken when we told her about the deaths of Emma Schrade, Estella Abreu, and Suzanne Morton. We gave Allie a chance to mourn. She cried, but I wasn't sure if it was stress or actual grief. I didn't know how well she knew the other girls. When Allie asked to use the bathroom, Terry said she'd stand by the door and that Allie couldn't lock it. Technically, we didn't have the authority to do something like that to someone who was not under arrest. But neither of us wanted to risk having to chase her down the fire escape again. Even if it seemed like Allie wanted to talk to us, there was no telling if she'd change her mind. For her part, Allie took not locking the door in stride. I looked at some framed photographs on the wall next to the breakfast counter. Allie with her mom at a play, with her dad at a shooting range holding a Beretta 9mm. A photo of her playing soccer in high school, her blonde hair flowing behind her as she streaked down a field. When we were all sitting around the breakfast counter again, Allie said, "I can't believe any of this. I've always been worried about my parents finding out. That's one of the major reasons we've kept everything so secret. We make sure that none of the girls know one another. Well, most of them don't know one another. We use burner phones, and all the calls come through this phone." She held up an older Samsung. "It's prepaid and untraceable." Terry said, "You didn't hear about the homicides on the news or in the paper?" "Who's got time to read the paper? I might have heard something about a murder on TV, but I didn't make the connection to any of our girls. Like I said, most of the girls are just trying to get through college and don't want their parents to find out. I rarely speak to them more than once. Usually just texts. I make it a point not to track someone down if they don't answer a text. I spoke with Suzanne more than most of the girls. She was always wanting to meet for lunch or a drink." Allie thought about it for a moment, then added, "I guess she hasn't called in at least a month." I chimed in, "Do you know who her clients were?" Allie shook her head. "I'd have no way to know unless it was a first-time client who called the main burner phone. Then all I'd have is a cell number." Terry asked, "How much do you make per event?" Allie shrugged. I'm booked almost every Friday and Saturday evening, and I usually bring home about $10,000 to $12,000 a month. You don't even have sex with your clients?" She shrugged. "Some of the girls negotiate for it as an extra. Not many. But the whole idea is that we're each responsible for ourselves." Now I ask the question, have any of the girls ever mentioned being threatened by a client? No, never. If I ever hear about a problem client, we cut them off and never deal with them again. We simply block their number. Once I had to tell a guy I was calling the cops if he didn't leave us alone. Our clients aren't drug dealers. They're businessmen and professionals. Since none of the clients know where we live, we're safe. At least, we thought we were. Do the clients know you aren't working for an agency? They know you're all on your own? That's one of the things I tell every client before any of us will meet them. They don't have to worry about anyone bothering them. The money has to be paid up front, and if one of the girls says no, it means no. I swear, in 2 years we've never had a problem. I asked, "Are you still in school?" I knew the answer already, but I wanted to see her reaction. She looked down and away from me. After a moment she said, "I dropped out of NYU last year when I had 2 $20,000 months back to back. My parents have no clue." I said, "Most parents have no clue about anything." Chapter 63. The longer we talked, the more Allie Pritt started to trust us. Terry Hernandez was the main reason. She was certainly more relatable to a young woman than I was. The story Allie told us was similar to a lot of stories I'd heard about getting started in the escort business. When she was a sophomore at NYU, a girl Allie knew asked her if she wanted to make some extra cash. She explained that Allie would act as a young man's date to a wedding, and that sex was not required. Allie attended the wedding, had a good time, and couldn't believe she got paid $900. The girl who had told her about the job took a pretty hefty cut. After that, Allie was in the rotation in the girlfriend experience. Eventually, she sort of took it over as other girls moved on or graduated. Allie said, "All the girls who work in the girlfriend experience are terrified their parents will find out or the cops will decide to bust us. Either way, we keep a low profile." I repeated, "So none of the girls interact with one another?" "Not that I know of. If I can't take a job, I have 1 or 2 girls I can call, and I keep half of the fee. The other girls in the girlfriend experience do it the same way. It's not like we're a bricks-and-mortar business. It's a loose alliance." "How many girls are involved?" "I hand off assignments to about 6 girls. Sometimes there are as many as 10 in the rotation. If a client asks for someone by name, I always send that tip directly to the girl. Otherwise, I sort of cherry-pick the better assignments." Terry Hernandez said in a low voice, "I'm not judging, and you're not in trouble for it, but I was wondering if you personally ever have sex with your clients." Allie hesitated for a moment. "I've had sex with 2 clients. I didn't charge them extra. It was mutual and consensual. I don't know how any of the other girls do it. There was a girl in Midtown who made it a routine. She made so much money she moved to Florida and retired. At least, that's what she told us." Allie looked at me and said, "The main reason we limit contact with one another is that if someone gets arrested, they can't expose everyone else. With a string of burner phones and a couple of shaky email addresses, I doubted we'd ever be caught." I said, "You might be overestimating your anonymity." Allie smiled for the first time during our interview. I could see why men wanted to be seen with her at events. She had a beautiful smile that caused her cheekbones to pop. Even in shorts and a t-shirt, she had a certain elegance about her. I said, "Allie, we're going to have to look at your burner phone to get some numbers off of it." She nodded, then said, "I also have them in a Word document. I keep all the numbers along with notes. You know, if someone was rude or rough. Maybe they tried to short me on the money. These are calls into the main burner phone. I don't know what numbers the other girls might keep. I had her email me the numbers list as Terry took the burner phone. It wasn't that we didn't believe her, but it's not a particularly professional cop who doesn't verify information. I opened up the list on my phone. This list was going to keep Walter Jackson busy as he tried to find out who belonged to each number. Somewhere in this list, I was sure was a killer. I said, "Have you ever heard the name Kyle Banning?" She shook her head. Allie seemed surprised this was all we wanted from her. Terry said, "There's something else you need to do." "Anything? Anything at all? I feel sick to my stomach that someone's dead from our job. I feel responsible. I'll do anything you want to help find this creep." Terry placed her hand gently on Allie's shoulder. She said, "The first thing you need to do is call your parents. Be honest with them, at least about the fact that you're not in college anymore." Allie nodded and looked away. Chapter 64. As soon as we were done interviewing Allie Pritz and certain she wasn't going to run, I told Terry I'd catch up with her later. I had an appointment I didn't intend to miss. I braved the midtown traffic and cringed when I found a lot that charged me $50 to park. Since I wasn't on city business, I had to pay out of my pocket. I walked 2 blocks to the building I was looking for. I took the elevator up to the 19th floor. The elevator doors opened into a hallway that led to the reception area for the Galt Fertility Clinic. Sitting by herself in the corner was my beautiful wife, Mary Catherine. The smile that popped up on her face when she saw me made any traffic or parking hassles more than worth it. She hugged me even as I was sitting down in the comfortable padded chair next to her. Mary Catherine said, "Oh, Michael, I'm so happy you came. Forget what I said about wanting to do this on my own. Why would you do this on your own? We're a team. We tackle all of our problems together." She kissed me on the cheek. The only other people in the waiting room were a couple in their 40s. The man nervously bounced his leg while the woman absently thumbed through a People magazine. I was surprised how nervous I was. The idea of Mary Catherine going through fertility treatments to have a baby had been an abstract thought before coming here. This place made it seem real and immediate. The clinic was immaculate and well-decorated. There were photos of mothers with newborns. Magazines about babies and child-rearing filled every table. I noticed the medical office had more plants than most, and less of that usual smell of chemical cleaning products. I'd already been through initial screenings, during which I had to give sperm samples and receive instruction on the numerous treatment methods for infertility. For some reason, Mary Catherine had it in her head that these appointments were a drain on my time. I didn't care if I was on the biggest, roughest serial killer case of all time. There was nothing more important than the health of my family. Maybe that was just my maturity finally kicking in, but a lot of it had to do with the death of my first wife, Maeve. She'd had cancer, and all treatment options had failed. We knew the prognosis was terminal. Even my NYPD bosses were sympathetic. And for 8 months, the family took the time we needed, essentially huddled together. Then there was a crisis, a big-deal hostage situation in St. Patrick's Cathedral. At the time, I was still an active hostage negotiator. The men holding the captives created several odd incidents, and I was pivotal in dealing with them. And the whole time I was needed on the job, Maeve lay in a hospital bed. She had needed me more. I should have stayed with my wife, and to this day I regret it. I like to think I can admit when I make mistakes. You don't make a mistake like that, then take lightly any kind of medical appointments of any kind. A young man in scrubs came out and met us. He told us his name was Lyle, and that he was assigned to us for the rest of our visit. I prayed this kind of personalized service was covered by insurance. Lyle led us down the hallway to an examination room. He said, "Dr. Pilar will be in shortly." Lyle looked at me and said, "Today, Dr. Pilar will be performing a sonohysterogram. It's basically an ultrasound used to evaluate the uterus. He kept looking at me like he was expecting a response. I nodded and felt Mary Catherine's grip on my hand tighten even as she kept a smile on her face. I resisted the urge to ask her if she was sure this was what she wanted to do. Mary Catherine had struggled with the decision for months. She had done her research, and I respected her decision. But when I looked over at Mary Catherine, I felt like a coward compared to her. I took a deep breath, turned, and kissed my wife on the lips. It was about the only thing I could think to do. Chapter 65. After the visit to the clinic and a coffee with Mary Catherine, I set about the rest of my workday. One of the things I managed to accomplish was to send Sergeant Kathy Figler, my friend in juvenile crimes, a copy of the security video that showed the bullies' faces. The sergeant said, "We're doing what we can, Mike. But with the violent crime rate moving up so quickly, the mayor's office is panicked. They got us out all over the city trying to figure out how to stem the violence." I completely understand, Kathy, and I appreciate your compassion. Every cop I know is overprotective of their children. I guess it's just because of what we see every day. Don't sweat it, Mike. You're doing everything right. We'll work it out eventually. It was with that vague, optimistic statement in my head that I settled down to a spectacular-looking dinner of enchiladas. Eddie and Mary Catherine had worked together to make an unusual and healthy version of the Mexican dish. Even Seamus had made it to dinner tonight. We said a prayer thanking God for all our many blessings. My grandfather added, "And let the youth of this city find love and compassion for one another." Jane quietly added, "And stop beating up my brothers." That smart remark earned a few snickers from her end of the table. It also garnered a glare from Seamus. Then everyone dug in. Chrissy blurted out, "These don't taste like the enchiladas from Taco Heaven." I was gratified to see Juliana step in and say, "That's because they're much better than anything Taco Heaven ever thought about making." She looked at the beaming Eddie, then at Mary Catherine and said, "You guys work so well together. You should open your own restaurant." I sat back and listened to the chatter. No one brought up any problems, no politics, some sports talk among the boys. Brian told us about maintaining the air conditioners at a renovated office building in Midtown. I was pleased to see how enthusiastic he was about his job. I decided I'd even have a glass of the Pinot Noir my grandfather had opened. Then my phone rang from the kitchen counter where it sat charging. I glanced up sheepishly as every head at the table turned toward me. Mary Catherine looked sad that I had to answer the phone. My grandfather looked at me like I was breaking every possible social rule. I was already angry at whoever was calling me now. It was like being awakened from a very pleasant dream. But any investigator will tell you that part of their job is being tied to their phone. At least a good investigator. Unless I am officially on vacation, and even then probably out of the country, I always try to answer my phone, or at the very least, see who is calling. I quickly excused myself and hustled over to check the name on the screen. Ronald Higdon. This time I would not add the Esquire. Great. I hesitated as it hit its fifth ring, highlighting the piano solo from Layla. Then guilt overtook me and I snatched up the phone. I said in a clipped, low tone, "What do you need, Ronald?" "Bennett," Ronald shouted into the phone. I could hear loud banging on the line. I said, "What's that noise?" "Ronald, what's going on?" "I didn't mean to cash it in so quick, but I need that favor you promised me." "Why? What's happening?" Now I felt like I was shouting into the phone. Some of the kids turned and looked into the kitchen from the dining room table. I gave them a wave like everything was okay. Ronald Higdon Esquire came back on the phone. "I need you to come to the shop. 2 of the turds from Brooklyn are back. I don't think they realize I'm inside. They're trying to figure out how to break in. I have a padlock on the outside rear door, just something extra. It stopped them for now." I could hear the panic in his voice. That was unusual for Ronald. He was the kind of guy who took advantage of panic, not one who displayed it. Then he yelled in the phone, Are you coming over to help, or not? Chapter 66. As soon as I hung up with Ronald Higdon, Esquire, I left my apartment and drove uptown much faster than I should have. It would have made more sense to hand this off to a patrol officer who could be there in 2 minutes instead of my 10-minute ride. But Ronald was right. I'd made a promise that if he asked a favor, I'd deliver. In the big scheme of things, this wasn't that tough of a favor. Except for the fact that I was leaving my family. By the time I got back, the kitchen would be clean and there wouldn't be an enchilada left. I don't care how much food was made at any meal. With 4 adolescent boys, there was never anything left. Chrissy even had said she was worried she wouldn't grow to her proper height because the boys never left enough food for her to eat. It wasn't true, but I appreciated her sense of drama. My tires squealed as I took the corner in Harlem and came to a stop directly in front of Higdon's Pawn and Jewelry. The place was dark. I started to worry that I was too late. I had a vision of Ronald sprawled on the floor with his head cracked open. I called him. He answered with alarm in his harsh whisper. "Bennett, where the hell are you? The guys got bolt cutters from somewhere. They're about to cut the outside padlock on my rear door." "I'm out front. Sit tight. I'll check out the rear of the building." Ronald sounded scared. Who wouldn't be? I jogged around the corner of the building and down to the rear alley where I noticed a blue Cadillac XT5 parked. I could hear voices. I peeked around the corner. A security light cast an eerie yellow haze across the alley. I saw 3 men huddled near the rear door to Higdon's Pawn and Jewelry and recognized 2 of them from our earlier encounter at the pawn shop. The third man was older, in his early 50s. He was short and stout, with graying hair, and held a pair of bolt cutters. There was a baseball bat leaning against the wall of the building, but no one appeared to have any other weapon on them. That was good news for me. Guns led the hassles. Maybe the older guy with them had a calming effect. If I'd had any common sense, I would have called for backup. I certainly would have felt more comfortable with a couple of uniformed patrol officers behind me. But sometimes you have to play the hand you're dealt. I stepped around the corner of the building. I purposely left my gun in its holster on my right hip where my dark red all-weather jacket covered it. I stood there for a full 30 seconds, and still no one looked up to notice me. I decided they weren't particularly effective burglars. Finally, I cleared my throat and said in a loud voice, "Business hours are from 9 to 6. All 3 men's heads twisted toward me. The 2 younger men recognized me instantly. Then I looked at the third man, his face now fully illuminated by the security light. I swallowed hard. I recognized him, too. Chapter 67. I said, "You're Sal Ventry, aren't you?" The older man stood up straight. He brushed off his jacket like he was about to meet a fan asking for an autograph. Sal Ventry was hardly any sort of organized crime kingpin. He was well known and didn't mind the publicity. But for the most part, he was a low-level member of a peripheral organized crime family. Then he said, with a thick Brooklyn accent, "This ain't none of your business. Who the hell are you?" One of the punks said, "He's a cop. He's a friend of Ronald's. We saw him the other day when the gang attacked us." I laughed out loud at that. "Is that what you told people? That a gang attacked you?" One of the younger men still had a black eye and a couple of cuts on his face. I was there. It was mostly a woman who didn't like their manners. Sal looked at me. "What kind of cop are you?" "I like to think a pretty good cop." Sal was not in a bantering mood. "Like I said, this ain't none of your business, smart guy." I cocked my head and didn't say a word. Sal looked irked. "What the hell are you staring at?" "I'm sorry. I've read articles about you. I like the one in Esquire when they called you the Ivy League Don. What I'm saying is, you're supposed to be educated. You went to Dartmouth, for God's sake. Why do you talk like you dropped out of school in 10th grade and hang out on the street in Flatbush?" Sal took a couple of steps toward me and lowered his voice. Okay, we'll play it your way. Please explain to me why you care if we solve our differences with Ronald privately. Because privately doesn't mean legally. You're still burglarizing a structure. I'm sure if you found Ronald somewhere, you'd assault him. So, if you prefer, I can call a couple of patrol cars and let them deal with you. The younger men looked ready to bolt, but Sal had been threatened too many times. It had absolutely no effect on him. We're just collecting a debt, trying to avoid clogging up the court system. He took a few steps closer to me. I started to tense for a fight. Sal looked at me and said, "What's your name?" "Michael Bennett." He stopped in his tracks. Sal said, "The homicide detective?" I just nodded. He gave me a strange look, but stayed in place. "You arrested Joe Paltrisi for the hit on Jimmy Vale." I did. I turned my body slightly so I could draw and aim if I needed to. These guys held grudges that went on forever. They treated revenge like other people celebrated birthdays. They loved it. I wondered how Sal was related to Joe Paltrisi. Without thinking, my hand ended up on the butt of my duty pistol. Sal took another step closer. His eyes narrowed. "Jimmy Vale was my godson. I was going crazy until you grabbed that animal, Paltrisi. Too bad no one has the balls to use the chair anymore." It was like I was looking at an entirely different man. His posture had changed, and he was using his hands to talk. I said, "I remember the case. It was about 6 years ago. Paltrisi tricked Jimmy into following him into an empty store. Then he strangled him." Sal shook his head. "He even knew Jimmy was protected. No respect, no common sense. Now there's 3 kids without a dad and a grieving widow." It was like chatting with an old colleague. I said, "I broke the case because of a simple fingerprint on the door. Then I got a warrant for a DNA sample from Paltrisi. I still remember the look on his face the day I arrested him." Sal chuckled and said, "You're okay with me. We all decided not to do that kind of business in Upper Manhattan anymore. It was all because of you. A newspaper article called you dogged." One of the Brooklyn brats heard him say that. The young man whined, "Sal, what the hell? We need our money." Sal called over his shoulder, "Not today, boys. I owe this guy." It's nice to be surprised this way once in a while. I liked how Sal scolded his young comrades as he ushered them toward his Cadillac. Sal looked at me and said, "This was sort of chicken shit. I was just showing the boys the old-school way of handling problems. You have my word that they won't bother this pawnbroker again. But tell him he needs to know who he's dealing with in the future." We nodded our goodbyes. I needed to have a good stern talk with Ronald Higdon. Chapter 68. First thing in the morning, I was sitting in Manhattan North Homicide's conference room. I was still a little groggy after my evening entertaining a local organized crime figure. I could have charged the punks from Brooklyn with attempted burglary or some kind of destruction of personal property, but they wouldn't have spent 10 minutes in jail. I hate to quote Sal Ventry, but it didn't seem worth clogging up the court system with petty bullshit. Now, Walter Jackson, Terry Hernandez, and my lieutenant Harry Grissom sat around a pressboard table that had seen better days. We had a lot of information from different sources that we needed to turn into an actual investigation, something that led us toward the identity of whoever had killed Estella Abreu, Suzanne Morton, and Emma Schrade. I was convinced they were all connected, whether we had the evidence to link them or not. I was trying not to get tunnel vision and just focus on one suspect. That's why it was good to sit down and talk things through with other people familiar with the case. One thing about my lieutenant, he doesn't need to run every meeting. Harry likes to listen. Don't get me wrong. He offers advice and insights, but he isn't so insecure that he feels like he needs to prove he's in charge. That left me to turn to Walter and say, "You're the one with all the information from the girlfriend experience burner phone. Was Allie Pritz right? And she said she thought most of the calls came from other burner phones? The big man nodded. Whoever set up this whole enterprise was very bright. You said this girl Allie also seemed sharp. There's no way we would have known about it if someone hadn't talked. The use of burner phones and keeping their profile low means they were able to operate without any concern about the police. You told me Allie was worried about her parents finding out. I think that was more likely than the police finding out. Walter had a slightly different demeanor whenever a supervisor was in the room. More monotone and less outgoing. I noticed he held back his urge to make puns on everything. I greatly preferred talking to my gregarious friend and listening to his puns in the privacy of his office at the side of the squad bay. He picked up several sheets of paper with printouts of numbers and addresses. Almost all the calls to this main burner phone were also from throwaway phones or phones that can't be traced easily. Walter slid a single sheet of paper to each of us. We each looked down at our sheets. Walter's narration picked up again. There are 6 names I was able to come up with so far. Terry looked up from her sheet and said, even a doctor was calling the line. Not really. He's just a veterinarian. Walter sounded dismissive. I threw in, still, they have to go through a lot of medical training. But they also solve problems by euthanizing their patients. That is nowhere close to what a medical doctor does. Certainly, they don't adhere to the Hippocratic Oath. I didn't know what Walter's problem with veterinarians was, but now wasn't the time to explore it. I looked down the list of the other names, and no one jumped out at me. Harry Grissom looked directly at me and said, How do you feel about this suspect, Kyle Banning? Certainly he's smart enough to use a burner phone, and the fact that he knew 2 of the 3 victims is a pretty good indicator. But his 16-year-old brother Jaden is also a decent suspect, and he can be connected to the 3rd victim. I shook my head. If I could have just had another 2 or 3 minutes to talk with Kyle Banning before their father shut me down. There's no way to check out an alibi unless someone tells you they have an alibi. Terry said, I like the timeline Walter drew up for us. He gives us something definite to look at with each suspect. We know within 12 hours when Estella Abreu was murdered. I have a 2-day window when Emma Schrade could have been murdered. The wild card is Suzanne Morton. The best the medical examiner could give us about a time of death was a 1-week window. I say we focus on Estella and see if we can figure out where either of the Bannings were during that window. As usual, Terry Hernandez had expressed a practical and intelligent way of going about investigating these murders. The good news was that there were no new bodies. That made sense if our suspect knew we were looking at him. And with the new names and numbers Walter had provided, we had plenty of work ahead of us. Chapter 69. Terry Hernandez and I split up the names for interviewing. It was the fastest, most efficient way to narrow down our suspects. Despite my belief that I was avoiding tunnel vision by looking at more suspects, I had to admit I really wanted to clear any doubt so we could indict one of the Bannings. That's one of the first issues always raised in homicide trials. Had we ever considered other suspects? Defense attorneys don't care who actually committed the crime. Their only goal is to convince jurors their client did not. Or more accurately, to plant enough doubt in the jury's minds to avoid a conviction. I'd quickly cleared one of the names from the list. A guy who ran a bar in Midtown had hired a girl named Carly from the Girlfriend Experience 3 times to hang out at his bar and attract customers. He said she did a great job, even had her personal phone number. He also had video surveillance of his bar that showed him at work during the time Estella Abreu was murdered. I called Carly, who answered the phone. Hey, this is Carly. Who's this? Her tone was flirtatious and friendly. I could see why men would want to talk with her. I said, My name is Michael Bennett. I'm a detective with the NYPD. Carly cut me off. She was not nearly as cooperative as Allie Pritz. I have nothing to say to the police. I'm represented by Jonathan Berg. I'm going to call him now and tell him you called me. Please don't call me again without going through my attorney." It didn't faze me. People say things like that all the time. I made a note of the attorney's name and figured I'd call him in a day or two. At the very least, Carly might give us some more insights into how the girlfriend experience worked. I had other things to worry about now. Before I headed to the next name on the list, ironically a lawyer in Midtown, Walter Jackson texted me 3 more names he'd been able to figure out from the numbers on the girlfriend experience's phone. I was completely above board during my next call. When the attorney answered his cell phone, I told him who I was and that it involved a homicide investigation. The lawyer, William Dexter, didn't ask any questions. I thought about the old saying that a good lawyer never asks a question he doesn't already know the answer to. Even though he worked at one of the big corporate law firms in Midtown, Dexter told me to come on over to the office so we could talk. Killers usually aren't that accommodating, unless they think they're much smarter than anyone else. I could see why these big firms with an international presence charge so much money for everything. The firm had 14 floors of a building overlooking 6th Avenue. The lobby had dark hardwood paneling and marble floors. The receptionist, a balding man about 40, had a neatly trimmed goatee that came to a sharp point under his chin. He looked up with his rimless glasses, but didn't bother to give me a smile as I stepped into the lobby. He said, "How may I help you?" His tone made it clear he really wanted to say, "You walked into the wrong office, moron." But I played the game and said, "My name's Michael Bennett. William Dexter is expecting me." The man looked surprised that I had the name of one of his attorneys ready to spit out when needed. He called Dexter from his desk phone. Then he looked up at me and said, "William will meet you on the 14th floor. He'll be waiting at the elevator." The man went back to looking at something on his computer screen and completely ignoring me. The elevator was a step down after the plush lobby of the law firm. Not that it was a terrible elevator, it's just that in the 2 minutes I was in the reception area, I'd sort of gotten used to marble floors and live plants. William Dexter was indeed standing just outside the elevator on the 14th floor. He was a lean, good-looking guy, somewhere in his mid-30s. His longish brown hair was styled to look like he didn't care about his appearance. His monogrammed shirt and silk tie told me otherwise. We shook hands, and he led me down the hallway. The 14th floor didn't have marble, but was still a high-end office. It felt like every other room was some sort of conference room with a spectacular view and filled with real plants. I said to Dexter, "You guys must have a great view of the parade. Like any of us have time to watch the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade." He finally turned into a lovely office with a view of a side street. He sat in a chair opposite me in front of his desk. He put on an earnest expression and said, "I appreciated you calling, but I'm not sure how I can help a homicide investigation." I said, "I don't want to bring up anything that's sensitive or awkward, but you called a phone number that's used by a group of young women who act as dates or escorts." That question got a reaction. He calmly stood up and walked to the door. He closed it quietly, then came back to the chair. Now, I was really interested in hearing his response. Chapter 70. William Dexter brushed a stray hair from his face, then looked at me calmly. His expression didn't change as he said, "The girlfriend experience, right?" "Exactly. I didn't violate any laws. I never had sex with the young woman who met me. I just needed a date for corporate functions. I think I used her 6 or 7 times. Always the same girl? Stacy, yes. That's the only name I have, a name and a phone number, which you obviously have. Stacy wasn't a homicide victim, was she?" I shook my head. "We're gathering background on people using the service. I also was hoping we could keep this conversation confidential until we make an arrest. I'm sorry, Detective Bennett, but I never make a commitment like that unless I'm retained as a lawyer. I will say I have no reason to discuss this with anyone else. I guess that'll have to do. I looked around the office. There were a couple of framed photos of Dexter running marathons. Clearly the guy was athletic, educated, and had a good job. He also appeared to have decent social skills. I looked at him and said, "You seem pretty squared away. I'd think a lot of people would want to date you, without charging you a fee." That earned a chuckle. William Dexter had an easy smile. "I work 70 hours a week. I train for marathons about 10 hours a week. If you factor in sleep and eating, that gives me 8 to 15 minutes a day to chat with people. A former colleague gave me the number of the girlfriend experience. It was easy. I'd make a call. Stacy would meet me wherever I told her. She looked fabulous. And it cost me less than maintaining a girlfriend in Manhattan." He gave a little shrug. That answer had an important element in it. I said, "You met Stacy from a referral? Do you know if that was common?" "Stacy told me it was the only way she got clients. It was a tight circle of people. That's why I felt comfortable with her." I nodded as I wrote a couple of notes in my pad. "Did Stacy say anything else about the girlfriend experience?" "She said something about one girl kind of running the whole thing, but each girl developed her own client list." Sounded like Allie Pritz had been completely open with us. I took a moment before I hit Dexter with a tougher question. I said, "Can you tell me where you were on the 1st or 2nd of this month?" "Ah, so I am a suspect, or at least a person of interest. Come on. As a lawyer, you must know we need to clear up a lot of things before we can charge the right person." I was about to go into more explanation when he held up his hands. "I get it, and I'm not interested in screwing up a homicide investigation. I can't imagine anyone who would." "Then you might be surprised." He started rifling through his side desk drawers. After a few seconds, Dexter plopped a folder onto the desk. When he opened it, I could see printouts of airline tickets, a hotel bill, and some taxi receipts. Everything checked out. Dexter said, "I was in Dallas at an arbitration hearing from the 1st to the 5th of the month. Ever been to Dallas?" "Once, on a case. I do kind of like the Cowboys." That made him groan. "I'm a Giants fan. It's tough lately. At least it's not as bad as being a Jets fan." I was ready to give him a zinger about his Jets comment when I heard a piano. It took me a moment to realize it was my ringtone. I looked up at the attorney, who nodded for me to take a call, which was from a number I didn't recognize. I said, "Mike Bennett. Detective, it's Michelle Finnegan." I knew the secretary from the Wolfson Academy wouldn't be calling me just to chat. I turned slightly, like it would keep the attorney from hearing anything, and said, "What's up, Michelle? I wanted to give you a heads up that we just heard Jaden Banning overdosed. He's done it a few times before. He left the academy without telling anyone last night and took an Uber back to his parents' apartment in the city. They found him this morning, unresponsive. The family's at Glendale General." "Thanks, Michelle. I appreciate it. Call me if you hear anything else. This could be important." I excused myself with William Dexter. It seemed like it was okay with him that I was leaving. He was already studying documents. Chapter 71. I called Terry Hernandez to meet me at the hospital. I felt a little creepy rushing to a hospital to see if a family was distraught enough to talk to me. I didn't really want to impose myself on anyone during a stressful time like this, but I intended to be available in case someone wanted to talk. As I made my way uptown, Michelle Finnegan rang again. She said, "Okay, I have a little more information. Jaden Banning told one of his dorm mates he needed to get away for a little while. He found some OxyContin at his parents' apartment. They didn't even realize he was at home until the morning when they found him unconscious on the couch." "Why did they go all the way up to Glendale?" "There are several hospitals closer to their apartment." Glendale General was on Amsterdam Avenue in Manhattanville, near West Harlem. Michelle said, "I overheard the headmaster talking with one of the administrators. Apparently the Bannings have been to the same hospital for the same reason a couple of times before. He said they use Glendale because it's easier to keep things quiet, and they're known to offer personalized service." I had to think about that for a moment. What kind of parent is so concerned about the family's reputation and social standing that they would drive past hospitals with an unconscious child in the car? I would say it made me revise my view of Mr. Banning, but my impression was already pretty negative. I asked Michelle, "Is Jaden in trouble for sneaking out? Will they kick him out of the academy?" "I sincerely doubt that. Parents pay a premium for the school to put up with this kind of foolishness. I see it all the time. And it doesn't help the students in any way. Like Jaden, he was sort of a known druggie. I think this was just a cry for help. He's troubled." I believed her. Jaden Banning was troubled. That's what was bothering me. I thanked Michelle and concentrated on driving. I picked up speed and cut over the Amsterdam Avenue. I used my blue light and siren, rare for me. I had to slow down a little bit because of traffic as I approached Holy Name on my left. At almost any other time, I wouldn't have thought twice about pulling over and going in to talk with my grandfather or check on the kids. Today was no ordinary day. I had to get to that hospital fast. As I passed Holy Name, I glanced to the right. Then I did a